Welcome everybody to Imperial 80s. I'm Tume. It's good to be with you again.
Hey, everybody! Good to be with you, Jay and Renee. How you doing out there?
Hanging in, man. At least it's nice outside. I don't know,
It
like
is.
summer came back suddenly these past few days. So
But you don't get scared, Renee. You don't get the global warming like fears. I'm asking. I'm like, I don't know.
I mean, I don't know that it's any more frightening that we're all going to be underwater, or that the next meteor is going to hit, or that we're about to get buried under like 50 feet of snow. I don't know that that's any more terrifying than like going to the grocery store and noticing a cop in my rear window.
Heard.
So, like, yeah. Like the whole thing is like, what are we doing? Every day I literally am just like, at least 10 times a day, I'm like, what is happening? Like, what are we doing? What is going on? So
we live in absurd times. And I mean, I think actually that's a good, first of all, folks, like, share, subscribe, get this out on your socials and everything else. It's good to be with you. But I think that's a good place to start, actually, because I think somebody said they can't really watch horror movies anymore because it doesn't approximate like the actual horror that we live under, and so it's kind of they kind of laugh at these little depictions, right? These personifications of the terror, of the horror of the world, into some silly monster or villain or something like that. That the real terror of our world is actually so much greater than this, that it doesn't even approximate it. Like, it can't possibly scare them or make them feel anything. And I think that's an interesting feeling now. I mean, I will say this movie was not at all scary to me to watch this time, and I do watch a decent amount of horror movies, and I don't, obviously you don't get scared as much at 43 as you did as a kid, and I know we'll talk about that too, but I don't, it's interesting in that way that I look at it, and I mean, I thought it was an interesting movie and a good movie in some ways. I know we'll get into that, but it really didn't strike me as that scary. And I think maybe that's partly that, I have bigger fears these days than Freddy Kruger.
Yeah. I remember, and when we talked about which one of these I would do with you all, you had given me a choice, and this was the movie that stood out. And then I realized after watching it that the one scene that I've always remembered the most, like, clearly, was actually in a later one, because when I watched it, I was like, oh wait, that scene isn't in this one. But it did have that weird, the other scene that also stood out, but it's the number 2 from all these movies. But it was terrible. Like, it wasn't, the effects are stupid. Like, like the whole, I was like, oh, and this really scared me. But then I was trying to remember when I watched it, and I was definitely like a kid, like a little kid, watching this at my aunt's house because she had cable and we didn't. So I'm a little older than y'all. And so I want to say I was like 8 or 9 when it came out. And so I would have watched this as it was like fresh on the cable, like the cable watching. But it's a terrible, everything about it is terrible. I was like, how did this scare me? But then, as you said, Jay, like, you have to remember, like, me at 49 watching it is a very different experience than me 40 years ago watching it.
And I do have a wonder. Also, it's, I want to bring this up at some point, if it's also like really attached to 80s panic that existed around children, which just still does exist. It's just gone to Law and Order SVU, right? It's going to that level, right? But the 80s panics and the way that we kind of contextualized violence and like the close to home violence, and or the person coming through the window kind of idea of violence, which I think was just really big when we were kids. So I wonder if it would even be scary to a lot of younger teens now. It could be. I don't know. I almost want to ask my students, do they watch this movie and do they get like riled up by it? Because yeah, I agree. I watched it and I find like its political unconscious intriguing. And there's ways that I can engage with the movie, though. There's a lot of in its unconscious that I'm like, oof, this says a lot about white suburbia and their kind of self-reflection that like they just don't get it. Right? They just don't fucking get it in it. But also, yeah, but like scary. So it's funny you said that. I was like, okay, I'm not really scared. So I was like, let me watch the last 3 minutes of Texas Chainsaw Massacre for 74. Maybe I'm just not scared anymore. And I'm sorry. When I watched the last 3 minutes of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, I was like, oh, that's what scary is. I was like, oh, yeah, there is a scary way to make a movie. I saw that last 3 minutes with Leatherface wilding out with the chainsaw. And I said, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, because I say there's an element of that just feels like possible, even though it is a metaphorical read. Like, they're not meant to be undead people in dreams. They're supposed to be real motherfuckers, But yeah.
Yeah, so I think we could start with like how we encountered this film, or what it was like, what our memories are of the 80s related to this, or when we first saw it too. And so I'll start. I mean, one of the interesting things is that there is so Craven was like a very repressed child. Like he lived in this Christian Baptist, right wing Baptist, white Baptist, church, and his parents didn't let him watch movies. He was only allowed to watch like one Disney film per year. And he says that he didn't see a real movie until he was a senior in college, because even at the college he went to, it was also like Christian and repressive, right? And so the first film that he saw was To Kill a Mockingbird. And he said that then he like fell in love with that and fell in love with movies. And he thought, oh, if this is supposed to be repressed, then like there's something wrong with, our society or whatever, or, and so you could see kind of within this too, and within some of his other work, his lashing out or his response, right? Or his critique also of like kind of these like controlling parents, repress isn't quite the right word I'm trying to think of, but like sheltered, I guess, in that kind of way. um and I think, as my parents were not in a repressive manner, but I've talked about this before, like they didn't let me see a lot of stuff, and we lived, out in the middle of nowhere. So my ability to go to like a friend's house to see stuff wasn't really until I was a little bit older that I could kind of. So I don't think I saw this movie until probably the early 90s, sometime. But that didn't matter too much, because Freddy Krueger was such an important figure in the 80s that I can remember vividly friends explaining to me like what Freddy could do, why you needed to be afraid of Freddy Krueger, right? And so the idea in this film that he's like the boogeyman of the 80s was like a very real sort of thing. And Craven also talks about this, but like, little kids were wearing this outfit, this costume at Halloween. Um, it was all a constant kind of playground discussion of like, Freddy versus Jason, like who's tough, which is funny because you don't get that movie until much later. But that was, I think they did that movie because they knew that like those two figures were so central to like, scary movies in the 80s, Michael Myers being kind of the third. And so, yeah, I mean, I remember all of that. I remember the discussion around dreams and the notion that, which I think is really important, and one of the, I'll say, cool things about this film, or like one of the ways that this film and the series is has like a nice innovation, I think, upon the horror genre. Although the problem that I find with it is that it's a specifically really targets children because um, adults don't have nightmares like this. Like adults have, we might have occasional nightmares, but like they're not the type of, when you're younger, you have your imagination is more active, your creativity is more active, and your dreams are more vivid. And when you have a nightmare, it's much more difficult to distinguish reality from the nightmare. And so Craven really like taps into that idea, and that's kind of the basis of the film, is this difficulty to tell, am I awake or am I dreaming? And this idea that you could be killed in your dreams, right? Which is like also a thing that you're told could never happen. Um, and so I remember that idea and discussions about that, and even being afraid of that idea a little bit, based even off of discussions, not even having seen the movie when I was little, but just because that was something that was out there. And yeah, I actually put in the show description as you were talking him to me, a conversation I had with Paul Renfro a couple of years ago on his book Stranger Danger, which I do think is a really good conversation. But for folks who want the context of the moral panic that existed around children being abducted and tortured and killed and that sort of stuff, sexually violated, all of that stuff. That book is really good. And it's important to say that it was a myth, right? Like that it actually wasn't something that happened on any kind of scale the way that it was promoted. It was promoted as if it was happening to hundreds of thousands of children, which is just a wild, wild number. And when they finally boiled it down, it was like, yeah, maybe a couple thousand a year, but a lot of it was, almost all abduction in the United States is family members. It's like custody battles and that kind of stuff, and almost all, uh, you know, sexual violence against kids happens by people who are a member of their family or a close trusted friend. So the idea that it's a stranger, right, or some person that you won't know or have some relationship, that does happen, but it's such an infinitesimal kind of portion of that sort of violence that occurs, that when it happens, they made big deals out of these cases, but they also did it to make it seem as though it was this really widespread thing. And I think that this film coming out in 1984, that panic really took off in the very end of the 70s and in the early 80s. And so yeah, it would have been right in the heart of that as well. So I think those are important early thoughts y'all shared.
Yeah, I mean, for me, this movie was the horror movie as a kid for me, which is interesting. Like the Jason thing I never really got into the hockey mask. Um I thought it was stupid, and I watched those movies, and like I probably laughed at all the like white kids getting like slaughtered by this guy. And we'll talk about that when we get to that. And a little that exists here in the Freddy thing, but it's slightly different for me when I was a kid. But I watched these movies pretty like regularly until maybe I got like 15. I aged out of it like 14, 15 that's when I started watching, more adult movies in terms of like, big budget shit or Oscar movies and shit like that. But yeah, I used to watch the Freddy movies, and Freddy was like he was the cultural obsession, like the glove. I think I had a Freddy mask, right? But one of the interesting things about Freddy is like I definitely would get scared, but I always also kind of felt like I'm from New York. I'm not from suburbia. Freddy ain't never coming to get me. There was always this distancing for me, right? Like I would have the nightmare occasional one when I would like watch the movie, and definitely probably subconsciously it fed into kind of some of my own fears if I would like develop them, but they wouldn't be exact with like the Freddy Krueger thing. But I also did have that separation of a buffer. And that's part of the reason I've realized why I was intrigued by it. And we'll talk a lot about that today, is I'm getting this peek into kind of how suburban people, which is a world that I had no connection to. I grew up in New York City, uptown, Black folk, Latinos, poor white folk, you know, like that whole like mix. I had no connection to any of this stuff. So I was like, oh, that's what's going on there? Oh, that's interesting. And like, you know, I mean, we'll get to it with this movie, you know, like the parents coming up and burning alive a dude. I'm like, oh, they go hard in the burbs, you know? So like, it's like I'm getting a peek into kind of suburban culture. And I watched it a ton. I watched all the movies, and then I got out of it after a while. And I know watching it now, there's a lot I can say with the context of time. And it's a fascinating film to think about the political unconscious of the 80s and how horror movies give a kind of subterfuge of emotions for whatever class of people it needs to, and how it maybe like pinpoints but doesn't reconcile. And that's kind of what I kind of dealt with here. But yeah, I was all in it. I was all in the Freddy shit for sure.
Same here. I mean, look, that was the thing, right? Like when Freddy came out in 84, I was 8 years old. And so every movie was like the new Freddy's out, the new Freddy's out. And you're like, you know, too young to go see it in the movies, but you're waiting to be able to watch it on cable when it comes out. And then it got to a point where it was like, y'all let Freddy die. Like, how are we still dragging Freddy out to fight with Jason and like these weird ass like extensions, because it was such a popular franchise when it initially came out. But it's funny because as Ntume was talking, I was like, when is the first time I encountered suburbia? And I think I was in college. Like I'm literally sitting here trying to think, when is the first time that I like drove and saw like a suburban neighborhood? And I think it was in Syracuse, New York, like right outside of SU. And so, well, not, you know, because outside of SU is the hood, like beyond outside of like Syracuse, where, you know, the university took over. But like, I'm like, I really don't know that I experienced suburbia at all. So I'm like, oh, I hadn't really thought of it that way. I think for me, I am a very vivid dreamer, and I'm still to this day a very vivid dreamer. Like I'm one of those people who dreams about flying and like all those things that people like to interpret when you dream. So for me, the idea, I can remember what was scary for me was the idea that somebody could come get me in my sleep. Right? So like falling asleep and dreaming about being asleep and something happening to me in my sleep. Like that was terrifying for me. But, you know, I grew up in a house where like dreams were things that people talked about, and you know, the whole dream interpretation thing. This is what happens when you grow up around Jamaicans. Like, you know, it's all about all those like spiritual stuff and the dreams and what it means when your palm itches. Like there's a theory for everything in Jamaica. Everything got a reason in Jamaica. So, you know, so it was a whole different thing. But there's so much about this movie and watching it this time. And I've seen this movie like dozens of times, right? Like dozens of times. But it's been a long time since I last saw it. Easily 20 years since I last saw it. And so looking back even now, like at like watching it and the details and the things that that occurred to me as I watched it last night, because y'all know I wait till the last minute to make sure it's fresh. I was like, this movie is what they are wilding with some of this shit. But it was also like, there was such beauty in the ineptitude of the police. Like there was just so much stuff that was going on that I was like, I can rock with this movie. Actually, I could do this. I could be all right with this and with some of this stuff.
That's funny. Yeah, I should say also, I mean, I did not have much experience with the suburbs either because it was a very rural setting where I was, which has its own fears and things like that for a child. But um, yeah, it was not it it was as foreign. I mean, I did go to high school in the suburbs, and so which probably actually be closer to when I actually saw it. Um, I probably saw it in middle school, but so yeah, yeah, it's interesting.
So I can jump into some kind of like context about the movie that I think is really interesting to think about, um, and how it came about and some of the key people with it, and we can kind of jump from there. And then of course, y'all add if y'all have any things in there. So I think the thing with like things like Nightmare on Elm Street, I don't think it's actually helpful to kind of start at the movie. I think you kind of do have to dig back a little bit. And I thought about this heavily watching it. And it also is helpful for me coincidentally because I've been I teach my students James Baldwin's The Devil Finds Work. And it's around the time that I teach it. And he has a great passage about The Exorcist that I'm going to read, not right this second, but at some point today that I think really applies. But I think you have to think about the history of the slasher film. And there's like no agreed beginning. Like some people say Psycho, movies like Peeping Tom, right? And they have a kind of like evolution. But then you also just have The Exorcist in the early 70s, which was a film that kind of let the public kind of change its perception of the horrors, right? You have Vietnam coming towards its end. The American public can't like really reconcile with it in a particular way, and you have like a kind of like a broad politic that wants to like, well, you know what, the world is just evil. They don't want to deal with like the real political material innards of it. So this kind of Christian explanation of why the world is the way it is fits for people, right? And The Exorcist really takes a hold, and there is remnants of The Exorcist in Nightmare on Elm Street. You kind of, if you watch it and you just think about it for a second, you go, "Oh yeah, totally,
100% with the
100%,
crucifix and
yeah,
the ceiling and yeah,
100%,
that is
the whole
exactly what
logic,
I thought of. Yep.
the whole logic." So you have that. The next year, you also have another film that I mentioned earlier that I think I do think is an incredible film. It's Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And that brings in the kind of idea of the teen, right? The wandering teens. And there's a proto element. They don't do it as much in Texas Chainsaw, but it is significant of the fact that the parents own the compound in Texas Chainsaw Massacre that they go on to one of the kids. So it's kind of the sins of the father, the sin, the kind of thing. So there's like the sins. So that kind of thing exists, and Final Girl, which we'll get into, is definitely, it's not started in Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but it's like reactivated. And this idea of like a slasher who comes in, and like I said, I don't know, I watched that final 4 minutes again. I was like, that shit's fucking scary.
I'm
so
gonna
you
have to go
have
back
that.
and watch that because
That movie's intense. That movie is intense.
I remember it being a creepy movie, but
intense.
I don't remember. It's been a long time since I've seen that one too.
It's an intense one. And then you have Halloween in the late 70s by John Carpenter, and this idea of like a kind of force of nature, and you're getting this new interpretation of like the force of nature character, and and that Michael Myers' real big thing is this like puritanical hate because he kills his sister, right? Because of the kind of like, she's having sex and all that, and all types of stuff, and the punishing of teens doing things, which then is like really caricatured in Friday the 13th. It's like I mean, I don't know if Jay agrees with me. It is, it's hard for me not to think of like just Friday the 13th as like a cheap Halloween knockoff in many ways. Like in many ways, it's hard for me not to think of it that way. I could be being a bit reductive.
The first one.
The first one, but probably
Yeah.
maybe not the later ones, but the kind of like maybe the germ of it is very much kind of like a knockoff of it. So you bring in Nightmare on Elm Street, and it comes from that tradition of everything, and it those films and that kind of like trajectory is really important. And then the other part of it is the 80s, right? And you know, it's hard to not think of like Ted Bundy in people's imagination at the time. It's funny. I looked up 84, and that same year, I don't think they had Richard Ramirez's name, but the was he the Night Stalker killings was happening. So these things were in the news, right? Or and you even on like the child molestation thing, you have the infamous Arnold Friedman case, which they made the documentary about capturing the Friedmans, the kind of panic around the guy next door is molesting your kids type thing was happening. And these are all in it. So it makes sense to me that the film was really popular. But you had like the Hillside Stranglers. There was all this stuff in the news of like these people who were going to come and get you. And it was so in it. And I talked to my mom about it, and she was like, oh yeah, it was every day. Like you just thought that someone was going to come through your window and grab you. So it's part of the like psyche of the time, and these kinds of movies are like feeding it, and it becomes this really big circle, even where I don't necessarily think maybe Craven was directly thinking, I want to make this movie about this. I don't think he was doing that, but I think he knew it was in the air. So he's like, I gotta like, you talk about the air that's there. So a couple of other like, I don't know. I could also pause. I don't know if anybody wants to say anything about that. I can go into more of the kind of technical stuff, but like that's a kind of like 80s framing and like the movie coming into fruition, more of a cultural thing. But I definitely have specifics about Craven and stuff like that. But I don't know if anybody wants to add anything there. Any other thoughts?
So it's like you're right, and I think similar to how like once Disney made a princess movie and realized how much money it was going to make, then suddenly like making these horror movies with this one killer who has like this weird story in their background, and now they're coming the sins of the parent, like, because that's also, we find out in later movies that's why Freddy's coming for these kids, is because they are the children of the parents who burned him up, right? Like there's this whole storyline behind that. But also in the 80s, I think I want to make, you said it, and I just wanted to like reiterate, like this whole like stranger danger thing, right? Like the whole, like, it's 10 p.m. Do you know where your children are? And, like I like those things, right? This whole continuation and focus on making sure that your children are not being confronted by weirdos on the street. And in the meanwhile, it's actually the weirdos you're letting into your house that are really the problematic ones. And so there was a lot of that. And what I remembered, and I went to look it up because I was trying to remember like when this happened. I want to say mid 80s is when that kid reappeared. I remember I know my name is Steven kid. Do you remember this story? He was kidnapped in the 70s.
I do remember this.
Yes.
I forgot. Yes.
And so he returned to his family somewhere around this time. So then, there was this massive, like, these stories of kids who get kidnapped and like, snatched off the street and all these things, because it was really this high emphasis on, be careful who your kids are around. And to me, it's all part of this engagement of law enforcement. We have to increase law enforcement. We need more people to protect your kids. Like, because at that time, and I said it before we came online, like in the early 80s, I was home with my brother, who was a whole year and a half older than me, right? And we were home alone, right? Like we walked home from school. My father was sick and hospitalized a lot, and then he passed away, and then my mom was working or in school, and so there was no there weren't doorbell cameras and cell phones and all these ways to track your kids. Like, motherfuckers were like on their own. Like, you go home and you sit your ass in the house until your parents get there. And it was, so they had to instill this fear, about your children being alone and what could happen to your children if they're alone, because parents had no choice. Like, they had to work. What else, like, if they're working until 6 p.m. and then they have to commute home and you're in school until 3 o'clock, that, the whole latchkey thing, like, it was a lot. But, as I really think about it, this movie in some ways was a lot of like, just because you're in suburbia doesn't mean you're safe, right? Like, you're not safe because you're in suburbia. Bad things happen in suburbia too. So it's a crazy thing.
Yeah. I mean, I guess just a little bit more on that. I mean, first of all, Paul Renfro's book, Stranger Danger, and our conversation with him are really good on that history and what was going on and where does that panic actually come from, because it's multimodal. It's not like it's just strictly a like top down, like we're going to disseminate this thing to, for some reason. It has multiple actors that play a role, including people kind of from, I guess you could say, the grassroots, right? Like a certain type of activists and things on like this. But um and interestingly, actually, the FBI was resistant to it for quite a while, right? Because they were like, this is not a good use of federal government resources for us to be trying to track down missing children. That this is exaggerated and it's usually local. It's very interesting, actually. Eventually they come around, and this is, Reagan really plays a big role in getting them to come to the table. But um the thing you're talking about, Renee, yeah, I think it's really important to understand, and people who watch this movie can see it. Like, it's the whole, like, they don't want her to go to school, which is like such a weird thing. Like, after all of these, that your parents would be like, don't go to school, but then she does. And there's a scene in the movie even where um Nancy's talks to her mom's trying to not get her to go to school, but then her mom's like, okay, well, come right home after school, right? Like, don't go. And I think that's like, as I watched that, I was like, yeah, I was like, because we didn't necessarily, right? And I think this is the part, is like, you could very easily, I mean, Renee brought up one version of it, which was you went straight home and you sat at home until your parents got there. I mean, there were other versions of
Yeah,
it, which
but
was just
also
like,
noting I was like 6 and my
yeah,
brother was 8, so
yeah,
it's a little different than a high school student.
yeah. I mean, I was a little kid in the 80s, but I mean, even like up until cell phones, really, this was just a reality of parenting, was that you allowed your kid a lot more freedom than we do nowadays. And I mean, this plays out, I think, in the horror genre always. Like, it's something that really animates the horror genre, is this, like, I think there's a legitimate fear that people had of like what could happen. But it was also interesting because it's somewhat mitigated by the fact that, because you couldn't get a hold of your child easily, the closest you could do is like call a friend's house and be like, is he over there? Like that kind of thing. Um, that they also had families also had to have a higher degree of trust with their kids and with their teens, of like, okay, like, I'm gonna let you do X, Y, and Z, but you have to be home by this time, or you have to check in this way, or I'm expecting that you're doing this and I find out you're doing something else, like you're gonna be grounded, or this kind of thing, right? And so I think it's really important. I mean, it reminds me of when Stranger Things first came out. I saw all these reactions from people online of like, nobody would let their kids just run around on bikes and like and I'm like, yes, they freaking did. Like, yes, I was out with my friend every weekend and we would just go off and my parents would be like, yeah, we'll see you later, or you know, my wife always tells stories of like when the streetlights came on. That
I
was
was
when you
just
knew.
about to say it. The street lights. Your ass better be on this porch when the street
That was
lights
my
come on.
grandma. That was my grandma's call. Yep, that was my grandma's call.
Yeah, so like, so it's just I think it's really important for people to understand that. And honestly, you know, there's a lot that we're critiquing throughout this whole series about the 80s, but I do have deep nostalgia, and I wish that many ways that my kids, like, even they, I think, feel uncomfortable, like, with the level of freedom that we had in terms of like, and I'll try to encourage, like, hey, just go off with your friends, like, be like, I'm not doing that, like, crazy,
Yeah.
and so it's
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 a
interesting.
different world. It's a different world. And sorry to cut you off, but just thinking about, because our kid, your oldest, I think, and mine are pretty close in age, because mine just turned 15 and yours is about to turn 16, right?
He's
And
about to turn 17. Yeah.
17. So, mine is now at a place where like his friends will come over and they'll walk downtown and go get ice cream or whatever, bubble tea, whatever shit they do when they're out and about together. But that it did take some time before he was like, okay, yeah, we're good to go, like wander by ourselves. But I live in suburbia. When we lived in Brooklyn and we used to send him, downstairs to get something, he'd be like, do I have to go by myself? And I'd be like, child, if you don't take your ass downstairs, it's next door. Go to the bodega and get a thing of salt and bring it back upstairs, right? Like, so it took some adjustment, but like I this was our life. Like manhunt, 20 kids in the neighborhood playing manhunt and breaking into the house that doesn't, that no one lives in right now. Like this was life, right? And there was no recordings. Like I thank God all the time that recordings and Instagram and none of this shit existed when I was in high school, because we'd be shit out of luck. Like, and if the little bit that and she knows now more, she more knows now the stuff that we got into when I was younger. But my mother would have had a meltdown if she knew all the shit that we were up to when we were out of the house as like a high school student, and I played sports and I went to school and up on the Upper East Side when we lived in we lived deep in Flatbush, Brooklyn. My commute was like an hour and a half one way to get to school, right? And so there's a lot of trouble between 91st and 5th Avenue and Flatbush and Nostrand Ave, right? Like there's a lot of trouble in that
A
space.
couple train lines, the issue.
Listen. So it is definitely a different, yeah. Yeah, it's still, yeah. It's different. And there's no explaining it to people now. Like if you did not grow up in the mid to late 80s, early 90s, there is no explaining what life was like then to kids who are growing up now. There's nothing to explain it.
So I want to jump into Wes Craven. Interesting. Got one other thing I will say, Steven in the chat. Yes, Poltergeist is another one. Very important, extremely important. And I think when you're adding to the kind of metaphysical understandings of why we have problems in the world and that are like our primary kind of battleground is something that's like beyond the human realm. Poltergeist is totally important in that. But yeah, get into Craven. And yeah, and I'm going to throw some stuff in and like we can all jump around. Craven's he's fascinating in like so many different ways. You could do a whole thing on Wes Craven for a couple of hours and talk about him. He's a really fascinating guy. So Jay already mentioned like his like religious upbringing. And if you hear him talk about it, like it just seems very damaging, right? Like I have this quote about him like talking about the family The family is the best microcosm to work with. It's very much where most of our strong emotions and our gut feelings come from. I grew up in a white working class family that was very religious. There was an enormous amount of secrecy in the general commerce of getting along. If there was an argument, it was immediately denied. If there was a feeling, it was repressed. I began to see that as a nation, we were doing the same things. So this is kind of like some of his ideas around Freddy, but like his general. So about his career, he actually didn't start in movies. He got very late. I think he was like 30. He said he started thinking about movies. He doesn't talk about this as much. He started in porn. And he doesn't really speak about it. There is it's semi-confirmed, though what he did, we don't know. He worked on like the Deep Throat movie, which is a very famous pornographic film. But no one really talks about it. He did another one. And he did a lot of interestingly different things. And then he eventually hooked up with a guy named Sean Cunningham. And he was working with Sean Cunningham's company, editing and doing stuff as an editor. He was a very like talented guy, kind of an autodidact in learning how to make movies, which a lot of those people of that period were. And they were like, let's make this like really cheap movie, which is called Last House on the Left, which I've seen. 1972. It's one of these early kind of independent horror movies. The guy in the film who's the villain's name is Krug, Krug, Kruger. So like is kind of like an idea he's already playing with. And yeah, and it's kind of playing like the Manson murderer thing, and like, you know, people are driving and someone comes and grabs you and slasher and gets killed and murdered. So that's also another conversation about that movie. Like, it's wild. People were protesting it, loved it. It became like this like cult battle thing, right? He didn't make another movie for a while. Then he made another movie called The Hills Have Eyes, which I've also seen. I don't remember liking it very much when I saw it. I know some people really love it. I'd have to rewatch it. That's another big film. And he starts to kind of build his career. Swamp Thing is the film that he does a couple of years before this. Swamp Thing, the famous comic. Which I think me and Jay have talked about. We're probably going to maybe even do the film. I haven't seen it in a long time. But this film kind of comes into fruition based on some articles that he read, which I find interesting. And I'm actually curious. I'm sure y'all have looked through this because like, I don't actually quite know how to interpret his interpretation of this. And they have to do with, and I'll just read, I'm going to read what he says rather than me try to say it. So he says, the film was inspired by several newspaper articles printed in the Los Angeles Times in the 1970s among Hmong refugees who were fleeing to the United States because of the war and genocide in Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, suffered disturbing nightmares and refused to sleep. Some of the men died in their sleep soon after. Medical authorities call the phenomena Asian death syndrome. The condition afflicted men between the ages of 19 and 57. That's a huge range, and was believed to be sudden unexplained death syndrome or Brugada syndrome or both. So this is what he says. And I've seen other things. He talks about like Pol Pot and all these interesting kind of elements. I'm not as versed in the history of it. And I didn't have time to really like dig through the efficacy or like the of the articles, but this is where his brain is kind of being drawn to. And I find it interesting that we're finding another thing that is connected to that history through the 80s. So it shows how Americans were thinking about places like Vietnam, so forth and so on in their unconscious, and how it's still kind of permeated. We talked about with like Lethal Weapon more explicitly, but like it's like pouring even into this in how they're conceptualizing, right? So he got really like obsessed with this idea of like dying during your dream, or the ability that the dream can have a reality component and it could like destroy you in the process. But Jay, I don't know, do you have anything else on that or any thoughts on that, or Renee as well? I'm very curious.
I mean, not a lot to that specifically. I did see the same, I watched an interview where he talked about that. And obviously there's kind of multiple influences for him for Nightmare. I mean, there's also the influences that he draws on for Freddy, right? Which is like this guy who was in his neighborhood, who terrified him when he was a little kid by like staring at him when he was like trying to not look at him. And, this, and he ran out into the street, and, the guy was still there looking, and then he disappeared. And, he says something about that guy. He says like that if you extrapolate that to the nth degree, you get the type of old man who will send young men off to war. And so, yeah, I don't know. I don't understand the connection. But there is an interesting, I mean, he's an interesting figure. So he's born in 39 is when Craven is born. So he probably, I was trying to figure out him relation to Vietnam. He might have been too old for the draft. But uh he does go to New York after, so like after he sees To Kill a Mockingbird as a senior in high school and decides that he loves movies. He lives in New York, and he talks about living around like hippies, sort of like counterculture, and like getting into drugs and sex and like everything, and sort of everything that he was like repressed from doing within his Christian Baptist family, that he kind of embraced. And so, he is an interesting figure. I do think even that comment on the type of old men who would send young men off to war, but then I can't remember what he follows it up with, but it is something less like, you could see that and say, oh, is he an anti-war, or is he an anti-imperialist sort of person? I think he has a critique of, but then that's what he says. He says, or old men who like tell young kids that their music sucks, right? And I'm like, okay, like, so this is a kind of, ageist, commentary, right? A generational commentary more than, but also a commentary, and I think this is the thing with good horror people, is that they do tap into darker sides of humanity, which are definitely there, right? And part of what he talks about as a horror director that he liked was, because he came from this repressive background, the idea that you wouldn't cut away in horror, right? So as the actual like killing is happening, or the blood splattering everywhere, or whatever, like, he kind of describes it as like a documentarian kind of aesthetic, especially in his first movie. But this notion that, people need to see that we shouldn't do the thing where like somebody's going to kill somebody, but it actually cuts away when that part happens, so that people don't have to see the actual gore that's associated with the violence. Like, you have to show what the violence actually does to people's bodies and stuff like that. And there's an interesting element to all of that, and I think that I kind of, I don't know how I feel about it totally, but it is interesting that we do that, and the kind of psychology around what we show and what we don't within movies, which, to me, you might have some thoughts on all of that as well. But I think the only other thing, I did want to read this quote from him that I found kind of interesting, and then Renee, you can pick it up if you want to. But he says, I've had people ask me a lot, especially people who don't like horror, why would anybody pay to go into a theater to be scared? This, by the way, is my wife's point of view. And I say, they don't go into a theater to have fear put into them. They go into a theater to have fear taken out. And the way that works, I think, and this is the humanities teacher who taught Greek mythology. So yeah, that's another important part of his story, is a teacher for a while. And read fairly deeply in all of that, is that life is scary, and life plays for keeps, and you end up dying at the end, and along the way there are lots of things that can kill you and and that causes a great amount of anxiety. Oh, and that causes a great amount of anxiety, and we kind of sit on it and mask it and everything else, but we need to deal with it in some way. And there's a couple of ways to do that. One is sports. What the hell? Where you basically have two clashing teams and kill them. And the other is a movie where you take a character, the hero, heroine, and put them in the darkest, most dangerous, awful places you can imagine. And I even think that the characters around a hero or heroine are elements of a sort of uber personality in that sense. It's like a folk tale that says, okay, the part of you that's going to have sex when somebody really dangerous is around, that part of you is going to be killed off. The part that wants to eat or sleep or watch television, whatever, you're kind of going with the audience saying, this is the part that's not going to work out for you. What you need to do is to face the reality, even though it's painful. Nancy and Nightmare on Elm Street, everybody wanted to deny that Freddy existed. She was the one person that saw him, knew he was real, and dealt with it. And I think that is a very positive message and story, and it's one that goes all the way back to Odysseus and many of the stories. I mean, David and Goliath. I mean, he's facing a monster. Come on, it's horror movie. It's a horror movie. They are throughout the Bible. So I'm just always amazed. Actually, people react to them so negatively, or so many people do. So I mean, anyways, it's like it's an interesting thing, right? And I think this is the thing about Craven, is that he is kind of like he's influenced by, Shakespeare, by the classics, by he's a well-read person. He's, I think, fairly cosmopolitan. And I think that's what's interesting to me about him. It's not that I agree, and we'll talk about like kind of where his social critiques land and like the limits of horror as a genre, as well as like what I think it can do and maybe what we could do with it, but also the limitations of it, which I think are very real. But that's kind of Craven in a nutshell. I think is like this kind of, it's like the Bible, it's like Greek mythology, and so yeah. Anyway,
So it's funny because it was on my list to try and like do some Wes Craven research, because I don't know that much about Wes Craven in general. And somebody in the chat mentioned that he was behind Scream, which I totally forgot about. And yeah, that was another one of these like massive franchises that's still freaking going. But so hearing all of this like background about Wes Craven has me cackling. Like the joys of not being on camera so people can see me totally like almost falling off my chair as y'all are talking is like hysterical. But this whole like how he manages to pull all of these different sides of things that influenced him into this one movie is actually pretty genius when you think about it. Like you got it all. You got the religious elements, you got the scary neighborhood guy, you got like the fake hero and all the people who are around her. Like he does a lot in this movie. So I guess I should give him more credit than I was initially giving, and thinking about like how crappy the movie was, like looking back at it now and comparing it to current like first cinema, right? Like how effects are now, and like even that scene in the alley where his arms are stretched, and then when he like goes to chase her, he looks really like awkward, right? Like the whole thing. And so but it's interesting, like these things that he pulled into the movie, and even his interpretation of scary movies. And I'll say, Jared, my husband agrees with your wife. He has no interest in scary movies. Like a lot of times he'll be like, why'd you watch that without me? And I'm like, because you don't like horror movies. And so like I just watch them without
my lady's the same. She's like, why?
Like,
why?
But there's also a really true element in this idea that like you go to watch something else in a way to kind of like fate, like experience something that you're trying to escape something that's happening in your real world, right? So like you go to the horror movie, and obviously like the guy coming in your dreams and killing you with the knife hand and all that stuff is not reality, but it allows you to like scream and to like actually like live this fear that you probably are masking and living with, every like that. What he said was also in some ways very nonsensical, Like he said a whole, there was a lot of words to say like very little. But that idea that like you go to a horror movie because you are horrified in your life. And so you want this little excuse to be able to scream and like do something that maybe is not really realistic, but it allows you to live that fear in that moment. That's actually kind of profound when you really think about it. And I'll shout like Matthew Solomon that I told you all about is watching right now. He just texted me. So we're going to try. He was like, don't ruin it like you ruined Red Dawn for me. So
Red Dawn need to be ruined.
It needed to be ruined. But shout out to Matthew. Like maybe there's more to Nightmare on Elm Street than I was giving it credit for.
Well, Jay, you wanted to say something? Go ahead. No, so I mean, that quote you shared is really, it shows that Craven and I'll jump into some things because he is a very classically thinking person, but Western classical in that way. And I mean, he's doing a long-winded explanation of catharsis, right? But if you look at certain theories around catharsis, I mean, especially the more like left-wing, even European critical, like people like Brecht, they saw catharsis as a way you control people, actually. Brecht felt that catharsis needed to be at best eliminated, but you can't completely eliminate it. You maybe need to manage it because, catharsis is also how you have like, Leni Riefenstahl getting Germans to believe in, the Nazi dream, right? And kind of like the purging, right, of your fears and creating a non-active person. But I do agree. I mean, I don't think Craven is a fascist. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying in those kinds of traditions, there shows something, but it shows what he's kind of working with, and it to me unlatches it latches out the problems because like I'll look at Freddy and I realize, oh, this is like old Greek shit, right? Like this is like old kind of mythology, right? That there's like a mythological totem for everything, and we have to destroy the totem. But the totem at the end of the day is still an idea. It's not an actual like material thing. And that's where I struggle. So a couple of other, Renee, you're gonna love, I don't know if you saw these. The other thing is, so the Freddy Krueger name comes from his childhood bully. Right? That's one, right? Another thing he said interesting is that he said he liked the name because it sounded German, kind of like a Nazi. And it's funny, man. Like it was in an interview, and I was like, I wish someone would have like had him elaborate. I wanted to hear more about that. And too bad Wes Craven has passed away. I would have loved to have hear his, but the kind of like the Nazi, because even if you look at Freddy's like sweater, right? And he says he gets the sweater from, I think it's supposed to be two colors that don't that like clash, or it's like hard for humans to see together. I mean, he was very interesting. He was really into the kind of kaleidoscope way of like designing things, and he was a very deliberate, of a very purposeful designer. Not saying that every little thing has meaning. I think some of it is just to kind of like distort your realities. Because another one of his big influences is Louis Buñuel, the great Spanish filmmaker, who would make absurdist things. So Renee, we talked about like the stretching arms and all that scene. In a way, it's actually not meant to be scary, I don't think. I think it's meant to be absurd. I think part of the thing with Freddy is that the scariness is that he's so jovial in killing you, right? He's not necessarily like going, so it's not like Jason or even Michael Myers where it's like dar, dar, right? Like really like that. Freddy's whole thing is that like he gets to play with you and almost even like make you laugh or make other people laugh while he's killing you. So it's like it's the sadism kind of thought of these kinds of people. So in a way, when we are laughing, and I do think this is a fascinating effect watching the films, it does become kind of an indictment. I mean, I don't want to talk about it too much. If you see New Nightmare, which people have criticisms of, his last kind of film, the only other Freddy Krueger film he directed, he kind of does make a self-criticism of what he did with this movie and what he unleashed. I don't think it's as far as he could have gone, but he is kind of talking about that, like, look, I have created a thing where the audience gets to participate in this. What does that kind of mean that I've unleashed upon the world a little bit? And like, that's a thing to kind of like wrestle with it. But yeah, it all comes from his, I think another interesting thing with Freddy, and we can start maybe transitioning into Freddy a little bit too, is that he was supposed to be a child molester first, but they felt that it wouldn't work. So they made him a child killer, right? So they brought, but like, I don't know how it was for y'all. I just always assumed that was part of it.
I'm like, I was about to say, was that removed? Like, to me, it was all like, I thought that was.
They never say the word. They never say the word, but like in everybody's head, we're like,
yeah, like he was, yeah.
I think maybe in some, I don't remember, but I feel like in some of the later ones, maybe it is intimated that he's also.
Well, they do it to his mom. That's the thing they do later. That he's a product of it. That's what they do, and that's what they do in 3. That he's a product of it, which we probably will get to 3 at some point. I think because like that's when it gets overtly Christian and to me really, really, really problematic. But we'll get to that at some point.
So one thing I did want to, just a couple of quick notes, and then we can move into the movie, I think. But one important contradiction for me, or just maybe not contradiction, but just thing I was thinking about as I was listening to Craven talk, right, is like, one, you have to remember he didn't go see movies as a kid, right? So like he doesn't have any experience with that. His first movie he sees, he's like 22 years old, right? So like, except for Disney movies, right? So the idea, and when he talks about his audience, he's always talking about adults. He's always talking about, he talks about the horror audience, right, as a specific film going audience that's usually single, like not in a relationship, that like, so he has this interesting idea in his head, which I don't know where he gets, of who the people are that that are his audience. And it's obviously not true because his films are massive, like so many people are seeing them. But also, like, people in relationships go see horror movies, like children see horror movies, teenagers see horror movies, right? So like, it's an interesting thing that I just find a little bit problematic, maybe within his construction of like who he's making it for and who's actually seeing it and what the effects of it are too. And like as he's talking about that idea, right, of, you face your fears, right? You go to the theater to kind of have your fears exercised, and like, and in it, he has Nancy who faces Freddy down, right? And that's what you take away from it, and it's like, I don't know that when I watched scary movies as a young person, that was not what I took away from them, was that like the hero in it faces the villain. Like, I mean, even in this one, like it doesn't leave you on that note. Like,
well, I was
it leaves
gonna say, that's not how it ends.
Right.
It ends with her still being literally locked in a nightmare.
Yeah, which is an interesting controversy we can get to later, because that actually wasn't his intentional ending. But it's also interesting because when I was a kid, I thought of it in a different way as well. But we can get to that in a little bit.
The other, just 2 quick points I did want to add, just for people who were curious. So he was an English and humanities teacher. He taught at Westminster College, which is now Clarkson University. And he also taught at Madrid Waddington High School, and that was in the 60s, right? So again, that would explain also why he wasn't in the Vietnam War. And he had a master's degree in writing from Johns Hopkins, right? So like, I just think it's good to know that backdrop for him, of him coming out of like English and the humanities and academia, really, before he gets into film direction. The last thing that I just wanted to say too is along that question of like the stretching arms and stuff like that too. One of the things I think is interesting about this film is that, like, to me, that absurdism quality that you see is very much connected to the notion that these are dreams, right? And so that idea that as kids you have stuff that goes on in your dreams that is absolutely like supernatural or beyond what real physics and human beings can do and how the world works. Um, and can look kind of silly as we look back on it in this film, but like that's the way I read it, is it's really trying to mimic that weird thing that happens when you're a kid, where it's like should be very obvious to you that you're dreaming. And for some of us, we eventually realized, that trick to sort of in your dream convince yourself that you're dreaming, right, which caused you to wake up, which they do deal with also with this film. But that quality is there in the film. I actually thought that was kind of a neat thing that he plays with that in the film.
Yeah, I agree. And one thing about the Buñuel thing that I think is also to add is, so Buñuel was a surrealist and absurdist filmmaker. But the thing about Buñuel that I always find very interesting about that these American filmmakers ignore is, but Buñuel was a leftist. He was a Marxist and a communist, and he had very, very those kinds of politics, and he used absurdity to talk about the absurdities of the West, of capitalism, and of this culture, right? And it's interesting because so much of these American filmmakers are influenced by these people, but I find it interesting what they take out. Like they take out the kind of absurdity, they take out like a bit of the social critique with it, but that like next level that Buñuel would have of like the really like material read of the degradations of capitalism and all this type of stuff, like they always like stop short, and I find it interesting. And I feel that with Craven, like and it's kind of like maybe if I'm giving like my large thought with Craven is that there's a way that he recognizes things that are very real and that have very real material like consequences to affect families in suburbia and the things that are happening. I think the ideas around parenting are all really real shit. But like, it's also weird to me that he locks it all to a street, right? Or a neighborhood, right? If you watch, so we can get into the film now, I'm watching the entire film and I'm waiting for one reference to something outside of it. And you don't get it. You don't get it. It's like horror exists in this circle. Now, I get what he's trying to do in the sense of saying that, look, this place has horror and that we need to face up to it. But to me, that just becomes a pity party to a certain degree, because I'm kind of like, the reason why you are in this space is because of a larger degrading system that's been degrading the planet, and now it's seeped into your world and not giving you the promise that you were supposed to get, right? From the 50s or whatever. So I'm watching the film and I'm like, I'm with you, Wes, but your critique's like a few miles short, right? You got to like step it up. Though I do get into like the overall social critique on, especially around the parenting. I think the parenting was like the one that really hit me the most. But yeah, I mean, the film, I'd be curious people's thoughts, like the beginning of the film, how it kind of starts off with like the dream logic and Tina and the young, I mean, I think we have to get into it, like the idea of like, pretty young girls, and I put pretty in a quotation mark, blonde, in like, their sleek clothes running down a fiery room. I'm getting all of these like, fire and brimstone thoughts as I'm watching it. And like I said, like I'm going back to my like 9-year-old, 10-year-old self who was watching this movie going, is this what's up with the white kids? I still do have that. I'm sorry. I'm watching it. I'm like, is this what the white, or like, not that it was actually happening. I'm like, was this white suburban kids' fears? Is this like what they were scared about? Because I was scared about other shit. I was definitely scared. And some of it was like large shit. Like I was scared about nuclear warfare. That was the thing that scared me the most. Right. And it sort of is 84. I'm like, nuclear warfare, man. Like, that's the thing that like scared me. But like, the young white girl walking down and hearing the screeches. And like, for me now, it's like so absurd. I'm like, But then I go, is this what like really scares y'all? And I kind of was like doing that kind of like, oh man, y'all are so sheltered.
So it's funny because I went to a school that was almost all white people, right? But they were all white New Yorkers who lived in New York City, right? So it's like it's not suburbia. So it's funny because I don't think I ever had that. No, you know what? I'm lying to you because this would have been before I went to high school. So I'm trying to go back in my mind to that time to think of like how I interpreted it. And I think for me, it was mostly like, is this what suburbia is like? Like her being outraged at the bars on the window and thinking like, well, shit, everybody has bars on their window. Like, what are we, what are we talking about right now? Right. But, so going back to the beginning, one of the things, and you didn't mention it, so I don't know if, because it was part of like the title sequence, it actually starts with Freddy Krueger making his glove, right? So, so the actual first scene before she's running is him constructing this glove that he then starts to use. And the glove becomes like this ongoing thing because the mom has the glove. Why she still has it like buried in her basement is beyond me. But like this glove that like she right, this glove that he put together, like his actual creation, making the fingers and like him putting the glove on. And so it starts with this almost like understanding that he is a regular person who has put this thing together, because there's really no indication that he made this long before the actions that are about to occur happen. There's no way to know that he would have made that when he was alive, before he was burned to death by the families. Like there's no concept of time when he's doing that, between when he makes the glove and when she's then running through the tunnel, right? Like in her nightgown. So that whole opening sequence with her running, and then them having the car, like the drop top and pulling up in front of the school, and the whole like this whole series of like, wait, is this what suburbia is like? Like, oh, so they just roll up to school and like in their car, and they jump over the side and they leave the car like parked on the street right in front of the school. Like, what is this?
No, you're right, Renee, because like that thing with the glove is like really to suggest like there's like a deep secret, because it's all, if you watch the beginning, it's all really like close-ups of the hand or parts of the hand of like fire,
right,
and things like that, and you get no context. I mean, do you get a glimpse of Freddy's face or no? It's just the gloves, right?
It's just,
right?
the gloves. And then and then he puts the glove on, because at first you're not really sure what he's making. Like he's sorting through, he's finding the blades, and then he's making the knuckle. And so the whole time you're like, well, what the hell is he putting together? And it doesn't actually come together until he slides his hand into the glove, and you realize that he's created a glove of knives. And I'm trying to, when was Edward Scissorhands? Is that 90s? That's 90s, 91. Okay. All right. Mm-hmm. So like, you have to start, like, if you think about Edward Scissorhands and like, how did that, I've never researched that movie at all. But now I'm like, wait a minute, like hands with the blades and the knives, is this somehow like, was there some influence between these two? And I don't have an answer to that, but it's now like running through my head.
I think totally 100%. Yeah. I mean, I'll add one thing. And yeah, that opening sequence, I do get this like Greek. It's like kind of like the ideas of like, the old European ding, ding, the creation of the gods, there's always like, when you read those old mythology stories of like how they were welding together, demons and demigods and all that type of stuff, or god of war type stuff. Like, and they play with it a little bit later, very poorly in like the later films. You see Craven kind of like suggesting, and it's forged in fire, so you're getting all the kind of Christian or proto, like early polytheistic mythology type kind of doing it, and then you do that, and then you like put a little blonde girl in like fire, and then next thing you know you have a drop top and Johnny Depp, you know. So it's like,
wait, as you just say that, can I just tell you how I forgot Johnny Depp was in this damn movie?
Yeah.
And so when they pulled up, I was like, oh shit, is that Johnny Depp?
He likes people. He likes people to forget. Also, like he won't talk about it, and he won't appear in anything about the movie. It's really weird.
Weird, interesting.
He's also just a weirdo.
So, as the representative of the whites on this podcast, and also as probably the person,
kind of, Jared. Don't forget what I told you. Don't forget what I told you. Only kind of.
And as a person, I mean, also going to high school very much in the suburbs and middle school kind of in the suburbs. But I mean, I think that part of what he's dealing with in this film is actually, in some ways, I mean, horror has this interesting role, I think, as a social critique of the hegemonic view of the suburbs to a certain extent, right? And so, you know, the 80s, obviously, we'll get into a bunch of these, I'm sure, at some point, you know, the Brat Pack, Pretty in Pink, Breakfast Club, like all of this kind of stuff, right? That there's so many films that that deal with suburbia and that present this very idyllic American, you know, that our vision of America should be white kids in the suburbs, right? Or like white teens in the suburbs, and like that this somehow is the quintessential representation of what America is. And I think that like we should talk about this with this film, because obviously there are no people of color in this film at all.
Featured, but there is a couple of black kids in the classroom. But they're not.
okay.
But not. You're right. As far as featured characters, no. And then we'll talk about Rod Lane in a little bit also. But I do. Rod Lane's weird. He's weird in this way.
Yeah. Well, but he has a different. He even had a different name, right? That he played as the actor of that in that. Yeah. But anyway, I mean, it's certainly supposed to be a presentation of you know, the white picket fence, you know, kind of suburb, upper middle class. And, you know, I think that Craven is, in his own way, with the limitations of the horror genre, like trying to say, you know, there's a lot of problems in the suburbs too, right? And I think this is the other thing about the difficulty is that, you know, I think that, you know, you heard Craven's influences, right? And the kinds of stuff that he's referencing. And so, you know, he's interested in creating a story or almost like a folk tale, right? Or like like that. So it's all supposed to be a bit abstract, right? Like, so it's not that, and I think this is the interesting thing that you could do with horror, right? Like how you can use the genre, but also like how, you know, if organizations wanted to have fun, right? Like have a horror movie night and then like do a different set of political education around, like, okay, so what is Freddy Krueger really in our society, right? Like what is the real, you know, thing that haunts us all in our sleep? You know, and I suggested like on our anniversary episode that, you know, for me, it's capitalism, right? But you could also say like white supremacy. You could say settler colonialism. You could say imperialism. Like, you know, you could say anti-black racism, right? Like, what are the things within our society that actually produce the real terror? And I think that that's like one of the interesting ways that maybe people in organizations or in other spaces could respond to like movies like this. And even stuff like Jordan Peele's, where I think like there's interesting social commentary, but also very much has its limits and you know, its liberalism, and this film does as well. But I think that nonetheless, that is part of what you see, because it's like there is a real question of what does Freddy represent. I mean, they talk about the mother when she finally talks about having burned him alive and being a part of the group of people that burned him alive. She says something like he killed like 20 kids in our neighborhood, right? Which is like there is no
Way,
historical
yeah,
parallel
right.
within like a
Like in
white
one
20?
suburban.
neighborhood, right? And and the crazy part was like her daughter is like 15 in the movie.
Right.
So the question that people have to ask is like, well, when the hell did this happen? Because there are all these kids who live in the neighborhood who are teenagers. So who are these like
Is there like
200
memory?
kids?
Is it memory hold that like
Right,
20 kids
right,
that they knew are dead?
right. Like it's just weird. But and sorry, Jared, I have a thought, but I don't want to cut you off.
Well, I'm almost done, but yeah, I mean, I think that that's the so yeah, I mean, and this it also connects into the kind of promotion of the mythology around Stranger Danger too. Is like this idea that the scale at which this stuff is happening is way, way bigger than it actually is. But I do think that the thing that, just to give some credit to the movie and to Craven, is that I do think there was an importance in films that kind of challenged this idea too, that the suburbs were this like, safe place where the only drama is like between like you and the school bully and like, some guy trying to take your girlfriend, or the girl who won't, say yeah, the girl who you love but won't take you to prom, or like, these kind of things. And I think that horror, does it does connect there. I think the problem is that it does become the thing that white people are afraid of. Like it does, like it very much did resonate with all the white kids and white teens and stuff like that that I grew up in it. And then, Craven also talks about Freddie kind of like standing in for a homeless person too, right? And so then you get this like idea that like there are these like on the edges of society, there are these weirdos who want to torment children and want to abuse them and all of this. And so I think part of the problem, particularly with films like this and representations like this, is that they actually do play into this for people who are not that evolved watching them or whatever. I don't want to be mean to people, but like it plays into this idea that yeah, there's some weird like other out there, the gay high school teacher, like whatever it is, right? That is our Freddy, and we got to get those things out of here, right? We got to kill them. We got to, we got to face that. And I think that's the thing, is like the point he's making about the world is scary, but we need to face our fears. Like, yeah, obviously, like that is real, but like what is the thing that we actually need to face and confront, right? It's not like this individual, figure in our community. I mean, maybe on some level it is, but that's not the, you know, there's systems at play that we need to confront, right? And it doesn't deal with that.
So for me, one of the things that stood out that I don't know if as a kid I really even paid attention to it, that I thought in rewatching was actually a very good way to sneak in some realities about suburbia, is the parents being as problematic as they were, right? Like you live in suburbia, but your mother's a drunk, right? And part of her problem is that whatever encountered between her and your father, they got divorced, and now there's this contentious relationship between them, right? That you your mother is often in Vegas when you get chopped up because she's off with her boyfriend because your father, quote unquote, like just disappeared and nobody knows who your father, like all of these things that are typically talked about as urban non-white issues, but actually existing in this white suburban one, like within this one block, right? You have a disappeared father, a divorced couple, and the mom's alcoholic. You have the one kid with the two parents, but the dad's clearly an asshole. Like you have this, these very interesting dynamics of parents living in this suburban area that I think a lot of times people don't associate with white suburbia, right? Like people associate two-parent houses with the white picket fence and the dog and, that whole thing. And as I say that, no one had a pet. Did anyone have a pet? No. Which
Not that I can remember.
In white suburbia, nobody had a pet? How'd that happen? How did he miss that memo? That's a weird thing to leave out as I'm thinking about it. But anyway.
Craven probably didn't have the money for that one. I mean, that's another thing I didn't bring up is this movie. I will give it credit for its they shot the movie for about $1 million, and the amount of stuff that they did for the effects was pretty remarkable. I mean, all the docs that I've seen, is all the people like, oh, it was great. We did all this. I would like the RoboCop version where they really dig and they go, that shit, I just can't assume that like the labor was always done well in that kind of way, paying people late, assuming all of that. But I don't have any evidence of it for this particular film. But I know, because I didn't talk about New Line Cinema, which we have to bring that up at some point. But yeah, like that kind of level. But to that point, yeah, it is fascinating. I lost my train of thought. What were we talking about before that? I lost my train of thought totally.
Just like the suburbs and like their problems and
yeah. So the first parent you see after Tina wakes up with the cross on her chest, right? So you're getting and it's funny because she's in that like blouse that has very Exorcist vibes for me, right? And she has like the cross, right? Is you then see her mom come in, and her mom just like looks like the lipstick is like on her face, right?
She's a mess.
She's a mess. She's been rocking out all night, right? And then this dude comes in who just looks like somebody she brought up off the streets. Like, come on back in, baby. Like the kind of like vibe, right? The wife beater, exactly. Right on his body, and you're just like, oh wow, these parents are a mess, right? And then you get to who was really honestly my favorite character to watch, like somewhat ironically, I will admit, is Nancy's mom. Nancy's mom is like a trip with like the hidden vodka. I guess it's vodka or gin bottles everywhere.
Yeah,
I thought it was like Captain Morgan coconut rum.
I don't.
Maybe
you could be
rum.
right.
I think it was
rum. I couldn't see the bottle, but they're like everywhere. And the way she does the performance, I can't really tell if she's doing bad acting or if it's like she's doing a kind of camp version of The Good Mother. Like, I've made you some warm milk. Like, it's so directed in this way of like fakery that I quite like it, right? And I feel like it's purposeful, at least maybe on Craven's part, to kind of construct her that way. But she's drunk, and then she's divorced from really the guy who was the only known person at the time, John Saxon. And people maybe know John Saxon from like Enter the Dragon and things like that. He's the chief of police, which you kind of find out like on like the back end after you get Nancy after the first murder, right? He's a dutiful father, but has this issue with like the mom. Like, all the parents are a mess, and you get it from it. The thing I'll say about it, because I agree with you, I think it does a good job, but I do think long term it's had a really bad effect on how white middle class people have chosen to look at the roots of their issues. Because if you look at a lot of these movies, even something that came with really popular, like Everything Everywhere All at Once, which I know is made by, was about Asian people, but there's a white guy who made it, and I still think it deals with like a white suburban logic, is this idea that the parents are the root of all my problems, right? And the larger societal critique of like how your parents are produced as part of a process, right, that deals with the world. This kind of political read, a material read, is like absent, and it comes to this very isolated way. So where Craven, I felt, was really good in like showing that, yo, this shit is fucked up. You think that the parents in the hoods and the inner cities are the bad ones, is happening here in the suburbs also, but in isolating it and doing no really greater read of like maybe why this generation of parents after the 60s, maybe because these are the parents who were absent from the counterculture movement and from the political movement, and it's because they were absent from that, they now have no ability to focus on the world. Maybe that's why it is. I don't know. I'd have to think about it. There's probably people who have thought about it and who have better critiques than me, or more developed critiques, but he doesn't make that critique. And I do think long term, that's why John Hughes, who I think is like a cousin to this, like you have to put these movies with John Hughes, it becomes this huge soup. And I think that's the really bad effect it's left long term, I think, on like our generation and generations below us, thinking of how we think about like the issues of like our development socially, and who do we point the fingers at, and so forth and so on.
You know, it's so funny you mentioned John Hughes too, because we're jumping ahead, but I don't think it matters because we're probably not going to go totally sequentially through the film. But at the end, when Nancy has, figured it, like, okay, I'm going to confront him, and I've got a plan for how I'm going to confront him. She like does this whole thing where she's like reading like, these books on, how to make improvised like anti-personnel devices, and all of this stuff, how to set like booby traps and all of this stuff. And she says to Johnny Depp that it's because I'm a survivalist, right, or whatever, but like, which is also interesting and in the context of the 80s and some of the survivalism stuff we talked about. But as I watched that end scene, I was like, this is Home Alone. I'm like, John Hughes totally stole this for Kevin McAllister.
Yes,
And
with
said
the booby traps.
all the booby traps, the freaking sledgehammer that comes down, like the
Yes.
trip wires, the like, exploding light bulb thing. Like it's all what, and I was like, John Hughes freaking stole that from A Nightmare on Elm Street. And I just think that's, there is a relationship there. And yeah, I'll take Craven over Hughes any day. But I know we'll talk about John Hughes movies too.
Oh, we have to.
I was going to say, I don't know if you can. I don't know if you cannot.
No.
My son just watched The Breakfast Club for the first time. Not to derail us completely, but his math teacher, for some reason, was like, extra credit if people watch The Breakfast Club, which I thought was really odd. Yes. And so he watched it with his friends, and I was like, so what'd you think? And he was like, oh, you were totally right. It was like, it's a real setup for like all these different quote unquote personalities that exist at a high school. He was like, what a weird movie that was.
So the movie kind of like circulates itself, like I kind of find around like a couple of groups. So we talked about the parents, right? And they're like interesting because like once the mother makes the revelation that they all killed Freddy, though you never get to know exactly who, other than you really get a key indication that John Saxon was definitely involved in it, probably. But you get like a kind of proto idea that they all were probably involved in it on some level.
Yeah, well, the mom, she has the glove, and she's like, she does eventually say, "I killed him." Like, so
I know she says that, but I was talking about the parents at large.
And also Nancy tells Johnny Depp's character, I can't remember his name, that like he's gonna come for you too. Like you're, like he's coming for us because of our parents. So she, she puts that out there.
And there's also when after I think it's Rod Lane's funeral, there's a way that Rod Lane's dad looks at John Saxon's character to suggest that they've like known each other for a very long time, because that's also the sequence where you realize when she first says Freddy Kruger, like right after that, and Saxon goes, "What the fuck, Freddy Kruger? What the hell? How do we know this?" But yeah, so we have the parents as one group, then we have Kruger, who is like his own kind of entity. Right. And then we have the kids. So we have like Tina, Rod Lane, Nancy, and what's Johnny Depp's character's name? Is it Glenn? Right? I think it's Glenn, right?
Glenn, yeah.
And you have this kind of foursome. And the thing that they like to do with it is like that they're all connected through like the shared dream. So they're all having this shared dream of Freddy, right? And it's I find it like a fascinating kind of locus to play with, because it's like he wants to make this suggestion that the teens are kind of onto something in a kind of collective way, that like the unconscious can like collective you. So there's like a kind of a well, it's not Freudian actually. It would be Jungian, right? The Jungian kind of idea of like a collective unconscious, right? They can kind of like, you know, all collect these things, and that they know, and you see them like piecing together all the little things that he's been visiting them, right? And you know, and then the other part of it is like, you know, they're at this unauthorized night together, which is like kind of going into the parents not watching their kids. And, you know, Rod Lane, which it's so, this is the thing about the white thing that I find interesting, because he's played by a Latino, Jesus Garcia. And it's like I said, I wrote down, I was like, he comes out of like a bad Happy Days casting call, right? To me, right? With like he's trying to give back that like 60s, but he's clearly shown to be of the four of them, the most unscrupulous of them all. And you know, he's brown. You could I don't know how y'all felt when I watched him. Even though his name was Rod Lane, I still get a brown vibe when I'm looking at it.
Yeah, I had a hard time with that. Like, are they trying to portray him as the one non-fully like white character that's part of this? You know, like his whole identity is like wrapped in this whole like he's a delinquent, he's got a history. You know, no one hesitates to even doubt that he's the person that killed this girl. Even though obviously, like even
Johnny Depp's like, he killed him. Yo,
yeah, he did it, and I'm like, but you were in the house, like you were in the house when this happened. How can you possibly think that he did this, right? And so that whole thing to me was like he was the other, and that's why it's so murky whether or not he's white or not white or anything. I think it was meant to portray him as someone who was in the community, but not really a part of the community. So he's a little dubious, you know, and he's the one kid that doesn't identify clearly as white. And I tried to, he was in one of those sports movies later on. He played, I think it was the one where there was like a football team in a prison. I think I'd have to like figure out, because I had to search. I was like, why does he look so familiar?
The Longest Yard, the original
yes, and I thought I was like, wait, was he in like one of these versions of the Jets and the musical? I can't remember where I'd seen it before, but like it was clear, like, so that was the other thing, like it played into these stereotypes also by doing that. Like the one othered kid is the one who's the problematic one with the criminal history, who like it's easy to point the finger at him as being the cause of the death of the white girl.
He's also like a bit sexually aggressive in how he like pursues it. Like when he like fucks with Johnny Depp, right? There's like these suggestions that they definitely clearly state that he didn't kill her, and that like, you know, he's also a victim of this situation.
Right.
But even like deposit the one, because like even when Johnny Depp wants to, you know, take it to the next step with Nancy, he goes like the frustrated 16-year-old thing, but you know, he walks away. This guy, like, you get that suggestion he doesn't take a no for an answer kind of person, and he will push it a little bit forward, and that Tina, kind of her like you know, primary contradiction is that like she's just kind of weak-willed because of the bad mom. So of course the weak-willed girl will go to this guy who's unscrupulous, and then also he won't be able to protect her against this mythical man, right? You know, and it's like it's playing with, it's like where Craven is making the criticisms, he's also using the shitty imagery And we'll talk about the sexualization of the young women as well. And he's not challenging that. He's like utilizing it, and then in a way like keeping it in our consciousness and normalizing it, further normalizing it.
Yeah, I mean, it's like one of these questions with Craven, I think, is does he give his audience too much credit sometimes, right? Because I think, and you see, like you can see within, by the time you get to Scream, right, he's like very deliberately making fun of certain things, right? Like Scream in many ways is a comedy, even though it's a horror film. But I think that it's like letting you in on the jokes, right? But I think that with Nightmare, I do read. So first of all, just to affirm, like I think you're both right, and I think that the myth or the figure represented by Rod is the greaser, right? Which, again, like Cedric Robinson talks about that all the way back in Forgeries and Memory and Meaning, and how that comes out of the Mexican Revolution, and that particular figure becomes a staple within Hollywood, because Hollywood wants to demonize the Mexican Revolution and Mexicans then by proxy, right? And this kind of thing. And you could see somebody mentioned in the chat, they said, AC Slater Steves, right? And totally, right? But also, Travolta in Grease, also, you brought up West Side Story, Renee, like this is the kind of, imagery, and Happy Days, like, the Fonz with the jacket and the hair and everything. And so I always find, especially by the time you get to the 70s and 80s, the greaser trope to be a little bit strange, because it often includes white people as well. It's it also connects in a little bit with, like, to use the Rambo terminology, with like the drifter kind of tropes, or a certain set of teen behavior that I agree is like being racialized in a certain way through all of these representations. But it's also something that sort of white people can take on as well. But I think that Craven very much, because he's pointing out um, that they all criminalize Rod for this, and they all assume that Rod is the killer, but he's not, and we all know that he's not. So to me, that is actually him critiquing it. But at the same time, like you say, and to me, there's a lot missing. I mean, I think that, in many ways, the real thing for most of the world to be afraid of is the white high school student who grows up in suburbia, right? Like that's like, so there's a lot that the film, just by creating, I mean, it's sort of like, to a lesser extent, I don't mean to like drag this too far, but it kind of reminds me a bit of people who get overwhelmingly concerned about, like, the psychological impacts of what's happening to Israelis who are committing genocide in Gaza, right? Or the psychology of the settler, or like these kind of things of like, and I mean, these children, they're born here, they live here, like it's not their fault, right, necessarily, like where they are within social order, but yet they will grow up to be the people who would, fight for imperialism, and who would keep these systems, functioning. And so it's an interesting, there's some problematics, I think, with engaging in in this kind of, I guess, I don't know, these tropes in that. Yeah.
I always say, man, Ferris Bueller in 20 something years is definitely doing evil shit. I've always said that. I've always said that.
Quoted regularly.
Right.
Regularly.
And he's, to me, like Rod Lane or whatever, like Ferris Bueller. Oh yeah, that's the person to watch out for. So yeah, so you get this like connection of like the young people, I mean, we could talk about the differences. Like so Nancy becomes like the significant person, and you kind of get that early. Like they talked about it, that like the kind of thing they wanted to do is to like make you think that Tina would be the big person, but that like it would be a bait and switch, and she would die at the beginning, right? And yeah, and Tina's death is like the first big like murder, right? And you watch it, which to me is like totally pulling from The Exorcist, with having her up on the ceiling, and you know, watching her get slashed. And like it's I mean, I know Jay asked about this, the nature of seeing the constant cuts and all that type of stuff. You know, for me, when it comes to that kind of violence, I'm always split in that I am not necessarily like just automatically against all immediate imagery depictions, but then I ask like, well, what's the purpose of it, right? And this is where we have to get into like the sexualization of the teens, right? And that, you know, Tina, I feel like for the majority of the film, we see her in her sleeping gown, right? And the scene right before it, we hear Johnny Depp listening to her and Rod like have sex, but like the way they do it is like so comedic.
Oh my God, it's so awful. It's so awful.
It's so awful, right? It's like comedic, right? But that's to me where like I can see where we're supposed to, in a weird way, embody the emotions of Freddy. Because then what becomes the completing catharsis? Watching her get killed for doing this salacious act where they're lying to their parents, they're having sex and doing this type of stuff, where we get to like watch her get slashed and like graphically, elongatedly. We are meant to empathize with Rod a little bit in that we can't do anything about it, but also like because it's invisible. And there is a way where Nancy is the lead of the film, but there is a co-lead where we embody Freddy often in the movie. So when I watch it psychologically, I'm like, I do think especially if you're really primed for that kind of conservative kind of way, that watching her get killed confirms that like, well, your ass shouldn't have been out there at night with your boyfriend. You should have been at home. This is what happens, right? That really conservative logic. That also existed in the Jason films and things like that. But this is like a new epoch with it when it comes to kind of like your dreams. Like you're not even safe in your own, like, you know, dream world.
That's interesting because now that I'm thinking about it, the idea that Nancy is the one that, you know, survives at least until the end of the movie, and she's the one who says no, and like, you know, we're here for Tina, like, let's not, you know, don't get distracted. And then, you know, the kid it's in his like, you know, as he's thinking about the different ways that he can try and get into Nancy's pants, it starts to get him in trouble, right? Like, so that's an interesting, because even that tub scene where like, you know, a lot of this is so sexualized. Like I had a note like, wow, there's actually a lot of like sexualizing of these children. And, you know, for as horrible as that scene is where he's like listening to them upstairs, I'm like, what an exaggerated, like, you know, this audio sex, right? But like this scene in particular is like that's like, it's just such a bizarre, like, what is happening right now, right? Like how is this, like the hand creeping up between her legs in the bathtub, you know, but she's obviously the one that's kind of pure, so she's able to like not, you know, he doesn't actually get to her. The mom wakes her up before anything happens. And then even when he pulls her down into the water, when she falls back asleep, like she doesn't get killed, right? So there's some interesting, and there's always like, you know, like this, and in the Scream films, it's actually something they point out, right? Like, don't go have sex because that's when people get killed in horror movies, right? Like it becomes like this this ongoing through line between horror movies and teenagers and their sexual stuff. It's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, and it's interesting because Craven also referenced that in like the quote I read earlier too. That like if you're gonna go have sex when there's a lot of danger around you, like you're gonna get killed, you know. And I think that's it's funny because I think he's trying to like do something very kind of like almost caveman times there. Like he's trying to make some kind of long term thing about like, hey, like this might not be the moment, right, for you to try to do that because you know that there's something scary out there. Um, I do want to come back to the collective nightmare. So let's put a pin on that because I think that's a really interesting thing. Um, there is a funny, I mean, Johnny Depp's character in that scene says morality sucks, right? Because he's not having sex with Nancy and he's hearing Tina and what's his name, Rod, go at it or whatever. And again, though, there's an interesting commentary with this because I mean, on the one hand, you could say, okay, well, Tina gets killed and she's the one who does have sex, right? And so there is a kind of, um, in that way, the film is doing the kind of morality policing of the 80s. And there's a whole, I think, separate conversation that maybe we should talk about at some point about horror and it becoming a thing that could be in major motion pictures, because for a long time it is kind of in the same sphere as like pornography. Like it is actually sort of outside of the primary movie houses and not really, and that really, it changes in the 70s. And I think big time with like Halloween and in that era that Mtume was kind of laying out. But Craven is, and they're doing this, and it was a huge risk. And as you said, it become. I mean, they talk about New Line Cinema as the house that Freddy built, right? Because the studio basically had nothing, and this became the movie that launched that whole studio into, kind of almost like mid-major status or whatever. And so the other side of it though is like the parents, right? When their response, right? And the cop father and all of this, and they're they're really like, oh, you were all shacking up, like what are you doing, this kind of thing. And yeah, like Tina and Rod did something that they're not supposed to the parents, but Nancy's response is like, we were there to protect, we were trying to save our friend from being killed, basically. Like it ended up happening, but like we're trying to stay up together, basically, so that we didn't have, another nightmare and Freddy doesn't kill one of us, basically. And I think that's an interesting thing too, because like part of what Craven is also pushing up against in some ways is the kind of strictures of the parents, or the way that the parents make certain assumptions, right? They assume, they're really the ones that assume that Rod is guilty. They're the ones who lock him up. They're the ones who are like, don't do this, don't do that. And so that, and they're the ones ultimately, right, which I think is the importance of the mother having killed, having been the one who killed Freddy, or that they all did it, but she talks about it and shares it, like that they're actually the ones that have caused this. Like, the nightmare, Freddy is a product of them, and they're imposing it on their kids. And I think that's an interesting, again, like there's a lot of interesting elements to this film that I kind of like, even though, there are aspects of it that I'm critical of as well.
Well, the thing I will say, and I do think this exists throughout all the Nightmare movies, it does exist, but on a very liberal locus. Listen to your kids is big into that. Like 3 is really about that. Like when they go to like the kids hospital, but like no one will listen to kids who have emotional problems, right? So I think that's why it also had a big purchase with the Suburban teen at the time, because like when we get to Nancy, I mean, Nancy is like a bit of a totem figure. She seemed as like a somewhat of like a teen feminist hero for many like young white women, or not even just white women, like people who are into this kind of like liberal logic of like the hero or the heroine, right? She is like that because she says to everyone very clearly, I see this thing is happening, no one listens to her. She provides evidence, like when she can literally pull Freddy's hat out of a sleeping moment and show it, and her hair is now changed, and no one really wants to believe her. And then she produces him, and they still tell her, go back to bed, or calm down, or, you know, it's not that, or it can't be that. So they're not listening to her. So she becomes this like totem example of like, don't listen, you're not listening to your kids and things like that. But it is a very liberalized overview of it, right? It doesn't, because I do think it's probably very true that people in that era, and many people don't listen to their kids, but like, or don't take them seriously. I'm not making that's like not a real critique, but like the way that like Craven is taking it to its ends doesn't really have a lot of punch to it, right? But I will say in his defense, like that is like the base of these movies, right? Like if it's anything, it's listen to your kids. They're telling you the truth, right? I do want to read, it's funny, there is this thing from Robert Englund, who played Freddy. He said that in Nightmare, all the adults are damaged. They're alcoholic. They're on pills. They're not around. And then another person says that, and who worked on the film, is that he feels like the parents are equally the villains. Right? He says like literally like there's Freddy and then there's the parents, right? They're like equally the villains. So John Saxon, if you see him in this one, he maybe is like the one person who kind of begins to rise above it, right? And I think in 4 they also do that too. Like maybe the parents, if they listen and like support their kids, they can make up for like their past misgivings.
Right on. Are there specific scenes that we want to talk about, or maybe specific characters folks want to go into?
I mean, we could talk about Freddy. I mean, there's scenes. Renee, you can jump in. Freddy, we definitely probably maybe should go into maybe a bit more also. But then, yeah, any scenes, I'm totally down.
So as we were talking about the characters and you know the sexualization, I have a little note that I wanted to make sure I didn't forget. So after that absurd like audio version of sex that we get, when they go back up into the bedroom and Tina's talking to Rod and he says like, are we done fighting now? I don't know if anybody else caught this. I had to rewind it because I was like, did she really just say that? She said, Jungle Man fix Jane.
And that's what I'm saying. I remember I was like, what is this?
I was like, what just happened? Like, what is going on right now? So there's that. 2, and as I'm reading my notes, I'm catching this. They actually do leave the neighborhood in the movie, and it's for the sleep study. They go, she takes her to get like whatever they were going to test to see what was going on in her sleep. That's not in the neighborhood. It's not very clear where it is, but it's obviously not in the neighborhood. So that's an interesting thing. And I'd like us to talk a little bit about, you know, the propaganda, right? Like the fact that like, you know, you had the cops are involved, but they're all stupid. Like they clearly don't know what, like she's, you know, like even the scene where she's like, Dad, you have to come in 20 minutes. So he sends the guy down and she's like screaming in the window. And
it's the funniest part of the movie to me.
He's like, I guess I gotta get the guy, you know?
Like, he's like, oh, maybe I should go get, right? Like she's clearly in distress.
Freddy's like literally in the background. The house is on fire. She's like screaming out the window. She's breaking windows out to yell. Like it's that part is hilarious to me. And I will say this, Craven is funny. Like, you know, and it is something that, you know, I think I haven't seen all of his films, but you know, the ones that I have seen, like his sense of humor does come across, and it's here, and he's definitely, you know, making fun of the cops in this movie.
100%. And it makes you, you know, I'm like remembering reading how initially when, you know, police, before there was like this real investment by police departments and the military to like, you know, screen and make sure that things were done properly. this whole making fun of police officers when they were part of a movie, like in the silent film, the police officer being the buffoon who's like tripping over things and all that stuff. And he kind of takes us back to that place. But then at the same time, right, like when we're at the point where she really does need someone to come and help her, it's the police that bust down the door and get inside and put the fire out and, you know, do the whole. So, you know, even though he does mock, because obviously like they're all buffoons, but he also puts them in a position to be the saviors when the time came for it. As goofy as they are, they still got into the house and saved her before something bad happened to her by Freddy. Like in the end, it still ended up being propaganda, no matter how much cushion was put in to mock them as the movie was going. And so like, you know, just one of those things again, where like, you know, did the police really need to be involved in this movie in the way that the police department was involved in this movie, right? Like he has to, like, he's in the prison cell when Freddy comes for him, and you know, they run down, but they get there just too late. You know, like all these, you know, like none of that actually had to involve a police department. Like all of that stuff could have happened somewhere else. Like it didn't have to involve a police department.
I would just say because it's the suburbs, it absolutely has to involve the police department, because white folks are not, they're calling the police. Like that's,
True.
you know,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it still exists in that, like think of like old westerns, right? The sheriff, right? The only person who can deal with this stuff is the sheriff, right? So it's kind of connected with what Jay is saying. So like, I think they consider like small towns in that same kind of logic, right? And because like, and it's also just like easy writing shorthand to make like Nancy's dad also the chief of police, right? It just solves so many like screenplay issues to make everything tight in a really corny way, to be honest with you. And they like doing that, making like the lead, either like the lead character's like parent is like directly like the issue, right? They did something, or they're like the mayor of the town or some shit, right? They love doing that, and you know, making Nancy's kind of dad that. But I agree with you, because then what it does for John Saxon's character is like essentially he's being a bad cop, right? By not listening, he's not also just being a bad dad; he's being a bad cop, right? So if he's supposed to protect the town, right, listen to his daughter, and by that time, you know, the good, he gets the opportunity to become a good cop, which gets in 3, it gets he can't be a cop anymore in 3, right? He's like lost his abilities and all that. And then even in New Nightmares, one of the only things I don't like about it, they actually use that as like the kind of like completion that he gets to kind of like complete it in the way that he wasn't able to do in the film, right? That's one part of New Nightmare I don't like. And I think is poorly done by Wes Craven, because I think Craven still, it's weird for someone who would make a film that has so much gore. He wants a happy ending. And we'll talk about like what he wanted the ending to be, right? He still wants like the kids to win in this kind of way. He doesn't actually want Freddy to be the winner. He's weirdly not that sadistic, as maybe some other, as like the people who wanted to keep making movies about it were and are, right? But yeah, I mean, I think another scene, if we wanted to kind of keep going through scenes, is that extended dream sequence I find interesting, where she gets Johnny Depp to sleep, right? Or tells him not to sleep while she sleeps and she goes to look for Freddy. And one of the things that I realized about watching this movie is like, I think this movie, it can be actually overly interpreted, because I think you have to take the Buñuelian way to look at it. It's supposed to be absurd in a sense that it's supposed to be somewhat illegible in a way that dreams are illegible. And when I was watching it, I was like, okay, I've seen so many like symbolism. Oh, what is the symbol? And I'm not saying there's no symbolism in it. There totally is symbolism in it. But I actually think the dreams is where often the symbolisms like they're there, but they're also like kind of not, like, because some of it doesn't make sense, right? If you think about it, right? Like, she's still talking to Glenn. Is she really still talking to Glenn? Like, you never really get those things answered, right? And that's actually kind of what I like about it. If you like let it sit in this kind of Boonwellian lack of logic, right? And it just kind of goes through, like, does she actually see Freddy walk in to see Rod, or is it a part of her dream, right? And you never get it confirmed. And he does a good job throughout the film, I feel like, stepping you into things, even in the final kind of battle scene that she does with Freddy. Because now we should talk about that too, because there's actually a way, if you think about it, it actually doesn't make sense if you think about it like logically, right? And it kind of, even with like the logic that she's setting him of pulling him out, because there's certain things you don't actually see. So it's an interesting like experiment, and I find it interesting how it's like worked with people in terms of like logic, lack of logic. But I also find like when you see like a lot of these film things, they want to pick through every little thing, and I'm like, no, I think part of the thing of surrealist logic is that it's surreal. It actually doesn't have a sensical nature. Now, the totality of the film is metaphorical, and there's lots of those things, and like the character, but those specific moments, like it's a shape-shifting thing that you're supposed to just kind of experience in a way.
Yeah, I really like that part of the film. I mean, I think that it, again, it very much it's interesting because not having seen this film when I was really little, but remembering a lot of my nightmares that I still remember from when I was really little. There's a lot of things in the film that I think are probably like, something deep in conscious, deep in our psychology and in our unconscious or in our whatever, that our collective, or that a lot of people experience these patterns or these issues within dreams. I mean, one of my favorites is when Nancy's running upstairs and the stairs like basically turn into marshmallows on her, like they suck her foot in. And I have so many memories as a kid of having a nightmare and something is chasing you. And for some reason, you can't properly run like you would be able to in real life to get away from this thing. You
Quickly,
keep
even
falling.
Tina running early, like, you know how slow she
Yeah.
doesn't really run, and like I felt that in dreams as well.
Yeah, yeah, that like you're trying to, but you're like bumping up against things, you're tripping, you're falling down, you can't quite get your footing. The ground is actually like doing a quicksand kind of thing on you. Even the confrontation with Freddy too, like that's also a dream thing of like if you are afraid of the thing in your dream, then like it will keep chasing you. But if you actually like confront it in your dream, usually you will wake up because it's like your psychology can't really like produce that. um and so there's a lot of interesting things. I also found like the conversation that Johnny Depp's character Glenn has with her. I didn't go in and research when he was talking about the Balian, right, people and the way that they use dreams and interpret it, and like their dream skills, and using your dreams, knowing what they do, and then trying to like do certain things with that. He talks about how they get like poetry and art from their dreams because of how they've learned to interact with their dreams culturally. I don't know much about that, or how much that's like just something that Craven kind of made up or took a kernel of and like did something with. But it doesn't surprise me, right, that different cultures obviously do have different ways of relating to the dream world and like what they would do with it. So I thought that was interesting. Um, the other thing about like kind of the absurdism of the dreams too, like in the last dream, or at least the last dream, well, she's still confronting Freddy. Um, like you'll notice that she goes down into her basement, and from her basement, she's able to go into the boiler room, which is presumably the school's boiler room, right? And like, so of course, like logically, that doesn't make any sense. But within the logic of a dream world, those kind of things do happen, right? Where you move from one location to another, and it's not sensical how you got from point A to point B. And I mean, I guess the last thing I'll say is just on this idea of a collective nightmare. I think that's where there's like politically interesting things that you could, again, like Craven doesn't give you enough there to say like, oh, the collective nightmare is, imperialism or white supremacy or capitalism or something like that. But like if you were to get together with people like really like saying, okay, like let's story like what is the collective nightmare that we all face? Like what are the actual collective nightmares? I think there's interesting work you could do there politically, like as an organization or a collective or something like that. And that's where a film like this, I think, has like some potential, but it's not because of like the film itself. It's because it's abstract enough and it's enough of a kind of parable or folktale or whatever that other people could do interesting things with it, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I guess there's a lot there, right? Because one of my arguments always about films is giving the filmmaker too much credit, right? Like people watching a Ryan Coogler movie and looking for the freaking Easter eggs and, oh, this is this hidden symbolism and this is what he was trying to tell everybody with this and da 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 da. And like, I mean, and I guess we might never know the answer, but I am curious if any of that actually was part of the process of Wes Craven making these movies. Like when all is said and done, Ryan Coogler has been very clear that he really doesn't care what people do as long as they buy their movie ticket. Like that's his, like that's his goal, right? Like go to the movies and buy a ticket and maybe buy some popcorn while you're there, and then you can go get a coffee after. Like he doesn't really care what motivations come from people searching for Easter eggs. So, and from what you all were reading, I'm not getting any vibes that like Wes Craven had any interest in like motivating people to talking about like, what the collective concerns are in community and those types of things. Like, and I'm very, very like his whole thing was started with with the with is that Beck that was in that movie with oh my god, I just forgot the name of it. With the attorney and
Which movie?
the one that was his first movie that he watched. Why did I use the name
Kill
of
a
it?
Mockingbird.
Kill a Mockingbird. That movie is the movie that was the first movie, right? With all the problems that brings with it, right? Like, because there's a list of problems that come with that movie, right? And so the whole idea of like utilizing movies for this end, for me, I struggle, right? And we like Jared, you and I have talked often about like how Malcolm X was like one of your entry points, and like wanting to acknowledge that and recognize like, yes, I understand that this was the entry point, but in hindsight, understanding how much was actually missing from that movie, right? And
it wasn't the movie for me though, it was the book.
But the book is also missing a lot, as we've now learned. Right? Like
yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And Alex Haley has his own like
Of course.
Right? And so there are all these things. So I don't know. Like I really, and I blame Ntume. I blame Jared. I blame Jackie. I now blame Samantha. Like all of you are at fault. I can't watch movies and appreciate them anymore as like things that could be a motivational factor for people to do things in real life. Like I just
want to clarify, because that's not what I'm saying. Like, so I'm not saying that somebody's going to watch this film without without an organization, a collective.
Oh, I don't think that's what you're saying.
A community. Yeah. And come to some thing of like, oh, actually Freddy represents capitalism. Like, and I'm not encouraging people to do that as an individual, like kind of practice. or to impose those sorts of that level of critique onto the brilliance of somebody like Wes Craven, right? Like, I think Craven is very smart and good as a liberal or bourgeois like art, what, and I think like that's where we have to have the limits, right? And maybe that's something that's we could talk about a little bit. I don't know. I mean, it's sort of part of this whole process of the Imperial 80s to kind of unpack some of this, because I think that him drawing on that long Western tradition, really, that he's drawing on when he's talking about the classics and Greek mythology and the Bible and Shakespeare and all of these things, right? Because Hamlet comes up in this movie as well. Um, that he's drawing on a tradition that is very much embedded within Western imperialism, within liberalism as an ideology. And so it deals at these levels of, okay, we can have a myth, and we can have a children's story of good and evil, and this kind of thing, and a battle between one person and another, and they represent these things. But it can't there are real limits to the type of social commentary you can make when you limit yourself to something that's that subjective. So that's that based in um, a couple of like personifying, right? Something that is much bigger than an individual. And I think that's the problem with this movie, and really almost all Hollywood films, is that they become films about individual people. And even if those people are supposed to sort of stand in for something larger, it's not systemic. It's more, it might be like a series of problems that we have, like our parents are too mean to us. So yeah.
Got it. And I sorry that it was sounding like I was more thinking generally about people trying to utilize movies for these purposes and always wanting to be extra cautious about, because I seriously, I'm so annoyed by the Easter egg thing. It works my nerves, and whenever I see people doing it, I'm like, y'all, these people don't give a shit about teaching you about socialism or revolution or whatever thing you think you saw in the movie. They care about giving you just enough that you can convince yourself that that's what they're trying to give to you. That's it. That's all they want.
So to Renee's point, there's this thing that exists out there about Jaws and Fidel Castro. I don't know if either of you ever heard about this. So
No.
there's this. It's not a myth. Castro once said that Jaws shows us capitalism, right? And how it eats and does this, and it's a capitalist thing, and all that, and imperial and all that. So people who like Jaws have done this thing that I think is not talking about what Castro is saying. They're saying, oh, Jaws is kind of an anti-imperialist movie. It's not true. What Castro was specifically saying was that Americans have an imperial attitude, and the things that come out of their unconscious show that. And look at this thing that comes out of the attitude of America, this kind of imperial thing. And he said, if you want to see the American ideological, how they kind of operate, just look at Jaws. He wasn't sitting there saying Jaws is this great anti-imperialist film. And you see people do it, and it's such a misstep. It's not saying so kind of. What I always feel with movies like this with Freddy is that just look at the political unconscious of how America exists, what they think about. You're not going to get the political read, but you're going to get how these people perceive themselves, right? And perceive their problems. If you really want to understand it, you need to get some tools to be able to understand it, but you're not going to get the revolutionary read, and you're not going to get the radical enactment out of watching A Nightmare on Elm Street. But there's so many people online who try and do this, and I totally disagree with it.
Yeah, and I don't know, Renee, I didn't mean to cut you off. I just wanted to clarify for the audience mainly that, like, you know, that
No,
I
and
wasn't suggesting that.
it needed to be clarified because I clearly gave you that impression. I didn't mean to. So I'm glad you did, so that people know that this wasn't really directed at you at all. It's just, and there are some really great, honestly, there's some great things that he does, even like as crappy as like the the conversation, like when you actually watch it, like realizing how really bad like the movie is, like just in general, but the interactions between the parents and the children, right? Like the mom, like the in the kitchen that morning, and the mother's like hiding the rum bottle like behind her body, like while she's talking to her, and like it's on the count, like the rum bottle's on the counter behind her. The kid's going to school and she's already drinking. It's like 7:30 in the morning.
The scene where she explains to Nancy that they killed Freddy. She brings, come down to the boiler room.
I'm not like, why did I have to go down to the, like, I was like, wait, why are you taking her to the cellar? What
and she takes the glove out.
Right.
I mean,
like,
I don't know how y'all felt. I just gotta say something. I mean, there's something about that. I was like, oh man,
why'd
these
you
parents
keep
are
it?
kind of boss.
Right.
But also, well, she needs her trophy. I mean, that's how I read that. I mean, I have this experience with it where I'm like, oh, these, because she explains it for people maybe haven't seen it. I find it intriguing. She's like, look, the court's fucked up. We had to take shit into our own hands. So we chased this dude and we burned him alive. And she's like, I kept it. And I was like, mom was definitely the ringleader. Like her, like Nancy's
right.
mom was
but
the
also
ringleader.
but also like, if he burned alive in the building, how'd you get the glove that was still completely intact?
She
like,
went
how
in
did
to
that
make sure
work?
he was dead. Like she's a,
like,
no, mom is just like, I feel like mom's backstory is wild.
Right.
You know,
there's definitely something else, like why are they divorced? Like you don't get any of this information, right? Like why are they divorced? How come? But they still live in the same town. He's still like, what is that dynamic like, to be the divorced person from the chief of police in your town? Like how quirky is that? And then there's also the conversation between the mom and Johnny Depp's character, when she goes in and he's asleep, and she wakes him up and she's like, she's like, I don't even know how you watch with like the headphones on. And he's telling her about like watching naked women on the TV. And she's not at all bothered by this. Like, she's like, oh, like, ho hum, like, what do you like just this bizarre conversation, right, between him and the mother about this really clearly like sexual thing that he's doing in their house, and she's not even pressed. She's
but
like,
then the dad, but then his dad is hilarious to me. His dad was like, look, just unplug the phone. You just gotta say no to these kids. Like that kind of attitude. I mean, this is where I did laugh out loud at the parents in this movie, and like the cops.
because they're wild. Yeah,
they're wild. Like they just keep doing wild as shit. I mean, all the way to the ending where Freddy just pulls the mom through the
little tiny door. Right?
And Craven even said the reason why he kept it is because they thought it was hilarious. They said they knew it looked all types of weird even back then, and they were like, "But this shit is hilarious. Right. We have to keep that." But that's what it is. It's like there's a way. I mean, he's poking at them all. He's like showing you, like, you see how absurd all of you are. Like, you all are like absolute, and you think you're good parents, and you think you're good, like, stewards of your children. Your child just told you he's about to watch some like wild porn shit on TV, and you like, oh, young man, and you just walk out the house.
That scene is crazy. And also, like, I mean, I guess we should say a little bit about the special effects in the film. I mean, because also it's very low budget. As M2 said, I mean, they couldn't pay people for like 3 weeks during shooting because like one of their like main deals fell through, and this was something that, like M2 says, they all talk about like very like, oh, we were fine with it kind of thing, but yeah.
There's a grip somewhere who's like, man, fuck all them.
But the the scene we talked about in the beginning with Tina, right, where she gets sliced up and then he like he spins her around. He's, you don't see Freddy, right, because Freddy's there in the dream only and the people on the outside can't see him. And so, he like spins her around and her legs like whack Rod in the face, and then she goes up on the ceiling. And there's an interesting thing Craven talks about is like in a lot of those scenes, in the scene where she goes up on the ceiling, and also the scene where after Johnny Depp's character is swallowed into the bed when Freddy comes out and like gets him at midnight, and towards the end, and he's got his big, it's not really big, it's probably like 23-inch, but this big tube TV basically like just sitting on his lap as he's sleeping with like headphones listening to a record, right? Very, very 80s. And he gets swallowed up by, into his bed. And then all of this blood comes flying out and it just like shoots all across the ceiling. And Craven said the way that those scenes were filmed was that all of the, which this is done in some other horror movies as well, but all of the furniture was nailed to the ceiling and then they were shot upside down, so that then gravity basically does the work of like the special effects, or making it look like Tina's like crawling along the ceiling trying to get out and that kind of stuff. And again, like low budget real effects, but it at least looks there's a realism to how it looks, for the 80s, which is hard to do.
Yeah, and they built boxes, like, so like they would build these kind of like sets of boxes, and they would do it all on that, and then have the cameras. And the actors said they were all really nervous. Like the woman who played Tina said, like, they never really explained to her like why the camera wouldn't just fall on her, right? And she said, like, if you see me kind of like scared, like I am. Like, she's like, I'm not like, I don't have to kind of play scared. Like, I actually am scared. And I'm like, I kind of want it to get done. So like, if I'm hyperventilating, it's because I'm like, I need to get out. I want to get this thing done because I'm afraid a camera or the furniture that's nailed up, the big ass couch or bed might just fall on me. She said she always was like very nervous about it, right? I mean, it's funny to listen to the woman who played Tina talk, because like if you think about her character, I mean, all this stuff that she's in body bags and all types of shit, and she was like, "Is this what professional acting is about?" She was like, "This sucks," right? She was like, "This is not fun, to have to be in body bags." She's like the only person that I kind of heard like speak a little bit like, "Yeah, that was like she's definitely grateful, but she definitely has that kind of vibe where she's like, yeah, that was pretty crazy." And like, yeah, we haven't seen her in those kind of movies again. At least I don't think, So for her, it was definitely an experience.
Yeah. And is this also, because I, again, like trying to go back in my memory to think of other movies, is this the first like white girl goes out to investigate, like, oh, that scene was so gross with the tongue coming out of the phone. Oh, disgusting.
So nasty.
I'm sorry.
So
I'm sorry. Finish your question though, Renee.
I'm sorry. So nasty.
It was so nasty, but appropriate. Like when you think, until you put that, I almost forgot about the tongue coming out of the phone thing, right? Like it's almost, it's just in line with like the hand coming out of the tub in between her legs, right? Like the actual like, that infringement on her physical being in a sexual way, right? Like if some random man just like went to lick you, you'd be like, oh, right? Like, so it's this continuation of that whole idea. But what I was thinking about was like, the white girl investigator in the Scary Movie, right? Like, what's that? And let me go find out what's happening, where that sound came from. Like, this whole idea that like you're gonna be the person who goes outside to try and determine like what happened. Did that start with these movies? Into like, do you know?
I think Nancy is the next stage.
Okay.
Because you, if you look at Jamie Lee Curtis in Halloween, she's not exactly that. She's more reactive than Nancy, and I think also is because Halloween takes place over one night. Though, if you extend the character to the other movies, you can maybe say that also, the other Halloween movies. So I don't know when Halloween 2 comes out. It's a couple of years after. It's out before Nightmare on Elm Street. I'm almost positive. But no, like I think Nancy, the reason why Nancy is so popular is for what you've talked about. She becomes this like figure. And if you think about with Freddy, except for 2, which we will have to do, all of his final people are women. But 2 is a young man, and there is the, to me, to be very negative and homophobic critique that they utilize with it. So they make a man the final girl through sexuality in this kind of way. But Nancy is another. So if you like people who are really into like horror lore, Nancy is considered to be like that next stage. And for some, that people think like she's the most feminist, right, in that kind of way. And it also like plays into things. I mean, those kinds of characters. I mean, Aliens has come out because Alien had came out in 79. Was Aliens the same year as this? I can't remember.
So Halloween 2 came out in 81.
So. No, Aliens is 2 years after this. So you're kind of getting, but Alien really, well, it's already been established with Alien, right? The kind of the woman who defeats, because they don't really ever put Sigourney Weaver's character in the final girl kind of thing, but I actually think you have to put that in that lore. So I think she's also in there as well, right? Ripley, right? She's part of that, like that kind of lore. If you think about it, because Alien is a horror movie, so maybe you could say Ripley is the other one as well. But Nancy is considered like, there's people like you, Heather Langenkamp, man, like she eats off this for the rest of her life. Because like she is like seen as like, she says I'm a feminist icon and a youth icon, right? And she is for many people because she is that kind of investigator.
What was that 10 series? Wasn't she in that 10 series?
She was in some stuff on a lot of TV.
Was it like
stuff. Can't remember.
Just the 10 of us, or 10.
Yeah,
something.
She
one
was
of
on
them.
A lot of like TV stuff.
But that was a long-standing series, was it not? Like that went a while. Didn't it have multiple seasons? Or no? Am I thinking?
Maybe, but I can't remember it.
You're right, Renee. Okay. So it's called Just the 10 of Us, and she was in 47 episodes of it from it was 88 to 90. I never watched that, but yeah, that was.
But she's known as Nancy. Like people just walk up her and say Nancy.
Yeah.
And
she's also in New Nightmare too, so she comes back for that one.
I have not seen New Nightmare, so I guess if you all are gonna keep me for the Wes Craven Nightmare on Elm Street thing, we might have to bunch it, like maybe do all the in between ones, like the series extensions, and then do New Nightmare separately. If I can invite myself back multiple times, because
I like y'all. Y'all like. Well, no, New Nightmares after the 8, but I think we should talk about it. I mean, I encourage people to watch it because I do think it's important to bring it up because there is a way. One of the things I respect about it, to not kind of give the movie up, but we're doing it away. Craven has a scene in the movie where he plays himself, where he basically admits he doesn't quite understand what he did. Like he says like I created something, and kind of how he still interprets everything is like there's like a kind of metaphysical force doing everything. So I was a conduit for it. But it is also an admission that he doesn't. So kind of the things that we're talking about is problematic. I actually think if you were to have a one-on-one conversation, if he was still alive with Wes Craven, he'd actually say, you're probably correct. I can't see those things, right? Because in the film, he's essentially saying that like it was bigger than me and I didn't quite do it. So the whole thing is about killing Freddy once and for all, right? And he's the only one who can do it because he's the creator. By making this film, I need to kill it because like it's basically run amok in ways that I didn't understand that it could.
Yeah, and I mean, New Nightmare is really interesting too because it is, and he talks about it this way, but it's really his bridge between Nightmare on Elm Street and Scream, right? Like it's like starting to move into this kind of meta or self-critical form of horror that he wants to engage in, where the audience begins to be kind of let in on the jokes or the the critiques, and they become a little bit more, I guess, obvious, but also the humor element gets upped a little bit too, because there's kind of an honesty. And but in both cases, I mean, they become franchises that, I mean, even after he does a New Nightmare, which is supposed to be the end, like they keep making Freddy movies,
Right.
and so
And was
in
it
many ways,
Freddy? It was Freddy versus Jason, wasn't it? Wasn't there a
yeah,
Right. And
yeah.
he wasn't
yeah,
involved in that. I mean,
no.
we can probably get to towards the ending. Like, he saw this as a one-off.
Mhm.
So the original ending of the film is supposed to be, so at the end of the film, we see Nancy do the whole kind of thing with Freddy. She defeats him, she gets it. And you got like the burning Freddy on top of her mom, right? Which is like I find the shot of like the mom like descending into the pit, like that's such a weird Christian kind of like, oh, I'm like, this is so weird. And it also further stamps like the mom was probably the ringleader, like, because Freddy went and
That is so true.
he went
Yes.
after the mom. I was like, oh, mom's was the ringleader. He was like, you know what? I gotta go get that motherfucker. So then, Nancy turns her back on Freddy, which essentially dissolves him, because if you turn your back on someone who's going to kill you, that means you don't fear them. So he kind of falls out, right? So Craven wanted basically the film to be a happy ending, for us to be confirmed that maybe even that by killing Freddy, that she was able to even get her mom back and all that, and it would be over and it would go through. The producer, Robert Shea, was like, oh, hell no, that's stupid, right? He was like, that's not going to really work for audiences. And then also, I mean, admittedly, Robert Shea was like, I think because New Line Cinema was not a company that had anything yet. And Shea hadn't really made a ton of money. He was like, if I can milk sequels out of this, that's going to be phenomenal for me, like Halloween and all these other movies that have been able to do it. So he was like, he wanted the ending to be, and you can see it if you go on YouTube. There's an ending where when Nancy walks out, and she gets in the car, that she sees where Glenn and Tina are in, and Rod, then she goes and looks over, and Freddy's actually in the car, right? And then they drive off. They didn't like that ending and so forth and so on. So it became like a kind of a middle, where basically then walks in, and the kids are in the car, and you get the suggestion that maybe it's been happy, and then the hood comes over and you see the Freddy stripes, and then and then you see Freddy pull the mom in, which I'd be curious people's interpretation of that ending. For me, I had always read it when I was a kid that Nancy was actually finally having a nightmare. Like, I never thought that Freddy was still alive. I was always thinking this, like, Nancy's finally went to sleep, right? And she's like basically remembering that it's like her trauma nightmare after all this has happened. But yeah, like, that ending wasn't supposed to be the ending. It was supposed to be a one-off. So Craven didn't really necessarily want this to continue. And then, but you get with the studios, and they're like, nah, man, we wanted to keep going. Though I also do think a happy ending would have been stupid. Personally, I wouldn't want to watch that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the happy ending would have been a little weird given everything. And to me, it's funny that you thought she was fine. Like, to me, the nightmare never ended. Like, she turns her back on him, right? And that's supposed to be like, when it first starts, you think like, okay, she woke up and now like this is the new thing. And then you realize, oh wait, she didn't actually wake up. Like, turning her back on him didn't actually work. Like, the danger's still there, it's still lurking, and she's in this nightmare still. And the mom, everybody that she thinks is now safe because she undid history. Because that was the other thing that, to me, I was like, I remember as a kid thinking like, wait, so is this like the whole thing was a dream? Like, everything that happened in this entire movie was a dream, and when she opens the door, this is her actually waking up from a dream that for us lasted for like 3 weeks. Like, is that what just happened? And then and then you realize, oh, no, she was asleep, and everybody is still dead. And she didn't undo everything that has happened in the past hour and a half. So it's, you know, for me, I think the ending, because it was so goofy, like how he pulls her through the door window, like watching it last night, I was like, well, that was stupid. Like, what just happened? But I remember as a kid being like, oh shit, like that jump, because he reaches through and grabs her, and it's supposed to give you like that last little bit of terror, right? Like that was the thing. It's interesting. It is interesting.
Yeah, for sure. The only thing, let's see, I had a couple other things. Oh, I wanted to go through, actually the chat has a lot of good comments and stuff, and I wanted to read through some of them. I mean, Steven said they didn't even want us playing Dungeons and Dragons, right? I mean, I think that's the other thing too about like it's a weird thing, because I think nowadays as parents we're like, oh, do I want my kid being on Roblox for 8 hours and like screaming at their phone and get in arguments with their friends, and these kind of things. Like we have things with our kids that we are trying to, we think we're doing something better or saving their psychology. And I think given how bad like cell phones are for human brains, I actually think we're right in some sense. But every generation does have their version of that too, right? Of like, there's something that I'm have to protect my kids from. And in the 80s, a lot of it was that, that kind of the occult, right? There's also the whole, we didn't talk about this, but there's the whole satanic panic, which also affects this era, right? And so people being
Right.
afraid of, say, Satanist
Yeah.
cults, like
Yep.
actually being a thing. And I think this also, along with the kind of, kidnapping panics, these like sexual abuse panics and all that stuff, like it, that those things are big in the 80s. And so yeah, I mean, people were Dungeons and Dragons, like later on Magic the Gathering, although that's 90s. But there definitely are these things where, a lot of parents, particularly Christian parents, but not entirely, like there were a lot of kids I grew up with whose parents wouldn't let them do Halloween, right? Like they were like,
Now that was big where I was from, for sure.
Yeah.
There's a lot of that. I remember that.
Yeah, because it's like celebrating Satan and like all of this kind of stuff. All right, yeah, somebody brought up, I mean, this is the other point somebody brought up. We do have serious child violence via Gaza. Someone else talked about how, nothing, American cops are more monstrous and real than any Freddy Krueger. Any national security state agent or IOF soldier is more evil, demonic, and real than any fictional character in any Hollywood movie. I mean, I think that's where you can get to one of the things about horror as a genre as a whole that does serve some purpose beyond this idea that like we're just going to the theater for, some cathartic or to connect into some, centuries long, mythology around good versus evil. And, it's that the evils that you create are these monsters, right? These supernatural figures, these things that are beyond reality, right? When there's plenty of horror in the actual world that these films are not, they may have a little critique of it, right? Like Craven does, but that critique is even still quite limited to the confines of the suburbs and the family unit and things like that.
So this is actually a perfect opportunity to share the Baldwin quote from The Devil Finds Work. So I won't read the whole section, of course, because it's a few pages, but Baldwin was not a fan of The Exorcist. He and if you know anything about Baldwin, his relationship to Christianity, so forth and so on, and then his political life, it could make sense to you why he wouldn't buy it. But what he writes here, this paragraph is very beautiful. And it's really the last two lines that I think is really important. I'll read it. So he says, "For I have seen the devil by day and by night, and I have seen him in you and me, in the eyes of the cop and the sheriff and the deputy, the landlord, the housewife, the football player, in the eyes of some junkies, the eyes of some preachers, the eyes of some governors, presidents, wardens, in the eyes of some orphans, and in the eyes of my father, and in my mirror. It is that moment when no other human being is real for you, nor are you real for yourself. This devil has no need of any dogma, though he can use them all, nor does he need any historical justification, history being so largely his invention. He does not levitate beds or fool around with little girls. We do. And that was his whole thing. He's like, why do we need to manifest this mythology of horror? Right. I mean, he didn't say it explicitly, but we all know he was anti-war, and in the Vietnam. He's like, look, literally these things are happening right there. Why do I need something about levitating beds of little girls to get scared? And if you also watch The Exorcist, there's a way that in the film, through Ellen Burstyn's character, she actually also kind of this thumbs off social movements in the movie very early. It's a very small scene in it. So he's having this reaction. And I read that recently with my students again, and then I watched Nightmare, and again, I was like, the same thing applies here. And I get why people could watch this shit and just go, heh. So when I hear that response you said or Renee or everybody said, these horror movies, yeah, we're seeing real horrors, because, who's killing children, human beings.
Yeah. I mean, this is all true, but it also goes back to what the quote that Jared read, which is people go to the movies to escape the reality of the horrors that they see on a day-to-day basis, right? And so for someone who, just like Laura, right? Not Lara. I think I was pronouncing her name wrong the whole time on your birthday thing. So Laura also said she doesn't watch horror movies anymore because she just can't, she doesn't have the stomach for it, right? And so, this idea that people can go to the movies to escape the horror in reality and quote unquote enjoy this fake made up horror because you can dismiss that, right? It's a horror movie. It's just, it's just film and editing and whatever have you. So it's it's interesting. And I we talk about this all the time. My day-to-day struggle with what's happening in the real world and how to get through the day doing the day-to-day things that you have to do to survive when you're very, very clear on the realities of what's happening, maybe not in your immediate life, but that you can't escape.
Yeah, absolutely. It is Lara, not Laura, but I mispronounced her name, but yeah, Lara.
Laura. So, okay.
And by the way, shout out to Lara. And tomorrow, on second anniversary of October 7th, we're gonna have her in conversation with Abdul Jawad Omar for the first time that they've done something together, which I'm really excited about. So hope people will check that out.
I'm stealing her. She's coming on Saturday this
week too. Please.
Fired up.
Please steal anybody. Yeah, I'm laughing. I'm looking through my notes. I'm laughing again at maybe I better go tell the lieutenant as as she's brutal. Breaking the
such a brutal scene.
We're gonna try to do a quick bonus episode. So folks that are on the Patreon, where we watch a couple of clips and laugh at them together, because this is definitely worth laughing about. Stephen brought up that their 9-year-old has heard of Bloody Mary. To every generation, there is a boogeyman. Yeah, and I think that's so this was interesting. So I had, I watched this, right? And so, as my 8-year-old logs in to look at our smart TV, right, it can see what was recently watched, right? And so he sees that I, watched it, and the little trailer pops up, and he's like, oh yeah, he's like, that Freddy Kruger, and he's 8, right? And I was like, well, how do you know about Freddy? And he said, "Oh, he's like, I saw it on YouTube, a thing about him versus Jason, and like, so it's amazing the life that this has, like, where there hasn't been a I mean, I guess there was the one in like 2018 or something like that, a remake, but he would have been too young to remember that. And he still was conscious of it. And so I asked him, I was like, do you think he's scary? And he said, a little bit. And I said, why? He said, well, because he just cut off his fingers and the juice spurted out of him and he licked it. And that's kind of scary. Because that's in the trailer, right? And so
Yeah.
it
But
was a
that's like
pretty
the thing
funny.
with it's just so absurd. I can think for a little kid, like that wily like gore mixed with the like that's what was freaky about Freddy. He was just such a especially in like the later movies when like he would personalize the dreams to each person and it got and
Yeah.
that shit was like, oh wait a minute, like what would
'Cause
my personal thing
that
be?
Roach Motel thing creeped me out, man. It's
And
still
his
like,
one-liners, you can
yeah,
check in, but you can't check out.
right, right.
Yeah. I mean, goes on to become way bigger than you can imagine as these directors. And I mean, that's an interesting thing that we've come across a few times in the 80s of like, same thing with Rambo, right, to some extent, or like um was there another one well, we'll get to Rocky eventually, but like all of these films, right, where
RoboCop,
RoboCop
they
for
all have
sure.
yeah.
Yeah, and then of course, it's very big with horror in the 80s, right? And so I know we'll do like 4 horror movies this month, but as we continue through the 80s, we'll have to do more and more because there's just a lot of the horror genre was huge in the 80s, and it was one of the places where you could do a prolonged series of movies. And somebody talked about the IP of this and like why do we do remakes too much. I mean, Craven actually had thoughts of this too. He was like, it's I mean, and he died in 2015, so he's making this critique in like the 2010s, but he's like, it's just cheaper, right? It's just easier for the studios. Like, it's not a great climate for these huge budget things, and if you have something that's ready made that has an audience that people will just go see, it's a lot easier than taking the risk on a new movie and being like, will this be a hit? And so I think that's part of it too. But all the 80s stuff gets remade a lot of times. Somebody else brought up Stephen King's It as, a monster that only went after kids. And again, talking about somebody brought up remember vividly a TV movie where a kid got snatched at the grocery store and that shit scared the ever living crap out of me. Yeah, I mean, it was big.
You know the thing
And it's in
about the kids, just real quick, it's just and I have a note and I can't believe I didn't say this out loud. The 3 little white girls in the white dresses skipping rope that reappear consistently throughout the movie. Like I don't even know how I managed to not bring this up. Like that was a direct like that speaks to little children. Like there is no world in which little children are not where that's not a kid thing, like the skipping rope with each, you know what I mean?
And the nursery rhyme, right? The
Yes,
fact
the
there's like
nursery
a
rhyme.
horror, there's a horror
Right.
nursery rhyme, never sleep again. I mean, and that's how that's clever shit that Craven did that I don't know if he realized would become so socially iconic. Right? Because think about everybody did it on their playground. After that, it became like a way to scare people too. Like, even though you got a bunch of kids, it's night, and then someone starts singing 1, 2, Freddy's coming for you, like, and they're like, oh shit, stop that, you're scaring me, right? I don't think he realized that these things would come out and just become these like great scare tactics.
Right. And the idea of something going viral just wasn't a thing. Like, so like the idea that one thing that you did would catch on and like keep on going and going and going. But I mean, there's all, that's what they did, these movies, like the Halloween music, like everybody learned to play that because it was like 3 keys on the piano. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, like it was a thing, right?
Yeah, and I said this before we started, but if I have one, like, I mean, obviously we have critiques of this movie, but the music in this movie is not good. Like for
Terrible.
horror movie music,
Terrible.
it's just not a soundtrack that is memorable, that has something like really eerie in it that kind of scares you just by the sounds of it. And you think about the great, whether it's The Exorcist or Halloween, like it does kind of fail on that note, which is one, which I think that's connected to why also I don't find it to be particularly scary. I think that the soundtrack is really important to a horror movie, and how it actually freaks you out is it actually has to have something going on sonically that you're like, oh, it adds that extra dimension, and I don't think it really does.
Just watch the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and hear that chainsaw bear. Like, there's no music, and you're like, yo, this shit is like, your heart starts pounding. I mean, the only time it would get scary sometimes is with the nails. Like, some of the sound design is good, but I agree with you. The music is not memorable. When you said that to me, Jay, I said offline, I was like, yeah, you know what? The score, I can't even repeat it.
Yeah, it's not great. All right, a few other comments before we head over and do a little bit of a patron episode. Again, Imperial 80s patron. The link is in the show description. All right. Yeah, white suburban accusations against city life of color are confessions. Yes, I think that's right. Are we going to do The Outsiders? It's a must. I think that we will have to do The Outsiders. It is an important film to do.
And I watched it recently, and I have lots of critiques. A couple of years ago, I watched it. I had lots of feelings.
Yeah. So these comments from Chitty Macho were really good. The scene also was a justification of mob violence, like the lynch mob. There are laws, but there's also the mob. Plus, lynch mobs kept souvenirs too. And I think that's
awesome.
That's a really important point, because I felt that too, of like, there's this weird thing where it's like you have a critique of the justice system, but it's the justice system didn't get the killer, right? Which, of course, if he killed 20 children, like like something needs to happen to that guy. But the on the flip side of it, that then it's like, okay, then the community takes it into our own hands, and we're keeping the souvenirs and everything. Yeah.
What happens at the end of Edward Scissorhands too, right?
Right.
They're like the suburban lynch mob, right? They go out. We're gonna go up in there and kill him, right? And then you get the blonde white male. He goes after him,
right? And also, like, as I'm thinking about it, like, was he the only? Because he was obviously like some kind of engineer or building, because this all happened, right? Like, he was working somewhere where he was maintaining a building, he was maintenance. So is he the only blue collar because like the mom doesn't work, right? You have these cops who aren't workers, in my opinion, and then you have these parents who get dressed, and you assume they're going to some white collar job to go to work, to quote unquote work, but they're no laborers in this entire movie.
I honestly feel, look, people who know the movies really well, I feel like that's a general thing throughout all the movies. The only adults I remember are the adults who work in the hospital and who's an orderly. The black man played by Larry Fishburne.
Right.
But I think you're correct, and I think it goes even throughout the series. You don't see laborers in that kind of way, except for like the one black male orderly, right, later. And the parents, I don't ever know what they do.
No, there's no indication of that, right?
Which is also a very suburban film thing in general. Right. All right. One other, so Leah, we will do the thing at some point. We're gonna do a lot of John Carpenter stuff. I think we're gonna do one John Carpenter film this month. We haven't fully decided yet which one it is, but we will. Part of the reason we're saving some of them is that they're better, and we can do them at any time too. It's not
the thing, we don't have
to do them in October. Yeah,
the thing just rocks. We can do that whenever.
All right, one last comment. So in those days, horny teenagers sat on the phone and leaned into their tingles. The phone became a symbol of sex in a lot of ways. This was a reference to the image of the tongue coming out of the phone. And I mean, that is very, very true. And it still kind of held that resonance for me by the time I was a teen of like, talking to your girl on the house phone, which is like a whole other.
But also like phone sex lines.
I was gonna say phone sex.
That was a whole industry,
Yeah.
right? Like the calling up to listen to somebody with the sexy voice thing. Like that was a whole industry.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, I mean, anyway, maybe for another episode, we can go deeper into that. There's probably a good 80s movie we could think about where we could delve more deeply into that, but it's still there for Scary Movie too, right? I mean, for Scream too, like the phone has such an important role within Scream. And I guess that's the last thing we should say is Craven has talked a little bit too about Nancy and Freddy as like kind of co-leads, and this idea for him that he never wanted to quite make it like full on, like, I guess, rapey or like, go too hard on the sexual angle, but he wanted it to be there, and he wanted there to be a kind of intimacy and tension between them that had like a sexual tension component of it, and that the audience to like kind of go for that in the film. And I mean, I don't know how I feel about that. I also think, again, you said Freddy blue collar. Also think it's interesting that there's always these references that Freddy is supposed to sort of look like a homeless person, being like all kind of tattered, and obviously he's scarred by the fire and all of that. But beyond that, I think that there's definitely a class dynamic to these films that
Definitely.
that you could see that is antagonist to lower working class figures. I mean, not just Freddy, but also we could put in what was his name again, Rod, kind of in that kind of class critique in the film. And even if Craven may be playing with it a little bit, like there's definitely nothing that upends that in any kind of significant way. All right. Any last final nuggets?
I'll share one last nugget. One other thing about the film that I find interesting. So I have a friend who's from the suburbs, and I used to make a joke with her. She used to be like, like my town was so bad, and like, it would fix all my issues, like leaving the town, so forth and so on. And then many years later, she said to me, she was like, yeah, that's a really bad liberal mentality of thinking that like my small town was the root of all my issues. She's an anti-imperialist and a very smart person. So she's like, she put those connections. And it's funny. I sent her a message. I was like, yeah, like the thinking of Nightmare on Elm Street is like your old thinking. And she's like, LOL, yes, like 100%. Like that idea that like Elm Street was the problem, right? Right. And, I'm sure if we further talked about it, it would be this kind of idea, like this like scamping home, this idea that these small pockets are like the issue, right? And it has to be solved. And if the kid just find their youth empowerment, they can find freedom one day. And yeah, it's if you think about Imperial 80s and the kind of, you were talking about ideology of that period, and thinking about the politicization of young people from the 60s to the 70s into the 80s, and really the depoliticization of young people. And you can think about how movies like this played a role.
Absolutely. Renee, thank you so much for coming through and doing this with us again. We will have you back,
for the invite.
of course, another time.
This was fun.
Any famous last words?
Nah.
So do you have Lara coming on this Saturday?
This Saturday. Yep. We're gonna dive into this whole peace thing that they're trying to claim they're trying to do. And especially now that they're talking about their meeting in Egypt and this whole thing, I couldn't think of a better person to have on. So I'm excited.
Great. Awesome. Look forward to that. All right. Thank you, Renee. Thank you, audience. Thank you, chat. Shout out to the folks who support us on Patreon. We will have a probably brief special episode on probably later today, and then eventually it'll make its way over to the millennials and within our Gates patrons as well. All right. Peace, everybody.